Tonight, everyone is here with Chair Amos on the phone. Are we able to confirm that Chair Amos is on the phone? Okay, we will have Chair Amos on the phone shortly. Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Adawandrian and the Haudenosaunee and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, and animals, ancestors who walked before us, and all of the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us. Could I have first, please, a motion to approve the agenda? Trustee Pappen? Any questions or comments on the agenda? All in favor? Good. Would you like to do it on here? I wasn't planning on it. Gail, we haven't set it up. We'll be using the Crestron machine for speakers list, but we'll vote by hand as we typically do. So, thank you very much. That passes unanimously. Now I'm looking for a motion to approve the minutes from our last Committee of the Whole meeting. Trustee Grabentz, thank you. Any questions or comments on the minutes? Seeing none, all in favor? Thank you. That passes unanimously. I'll draw your attention to the order paper and ask if there are any questions on the order paper for this evening. Okay, seeing none at this moment in time. Oh, sorry. Trustee Harvey-Hope.
I'm just curious whether or not the second one needs to still be there. I guess Trustee Collard can tell us about that. Subcommittee for the consent agenda.
It can be removed now. Thank you. We'll make that correction for the next meeting. Okay. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to our Program and Accommodation Committee, and it is co-chaired by Trustee Al Harrison and Trustee Oliver, who are both sitting here beside me this evening. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening and welcome, trustees, staff, and members of the community to a meeting of the Program and Accommodation Committee of the Committee of the Whole. For the sake of the community members, I am Trustee Oliver, and next to me is Trustee Al Harrison. She and I co-chair this committee. Tonight, our first item on the agenda is a discussion on the Burlington Secondary Program and Accommodation Review. Director Miller will present to us on the review and on his report, number 17075, and his recommendations to the Board of Trustees. After that, we will have time for trustee questions and comments, which Trustee Al Harrison and I will facilitate. Before Director Miller begins, we would like to set the background for this item. On October 19, 2016, the Halton District School Board of Trustees approved motion M16-0153 of the report 16132, initiating a program and accommodation review for all Burlington secondary schools. The formal program and accommodation review, or PAR process, commenced with an orientation session on for the PAR committee members on December 1st, 2016, with the first public meeting held on December 8th, 2016. As a result of this process, the director's report and recommendations, a topic of our discussion tonight, was released to the trustees and the public last Friday, April 21st, 2017.
Thank you. So it's Trustee Al Harrison here. Thanks, Trustee Oliver. You'll notice that our nameplates are reversed. That's a skill testing question for later in the meeting. So I just wanted to set some process context for everyone. Firstly, the director and colleagues will present their report. Trustee questions and answers will follow. We'll do our best to, firstly, we'll ask people to utilize the machine to indicate that you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. We'll do our best then to follow the discussion threads. So for example, if a trustee indicates a question on the Crestron, we'll try and follow up and see if there are any similarly topicked questions and follow through the discussion thread in that regard. Follow-ups will also be timed. We'll be keeping to our 3-minute limit as we normally do, and then we'll move back to the next speaker on the E-list. When Trustee Oliver and I have questions, we'll relinquish the chair to the other one. In terms of meeting decorum, trustees are reminded of their code of conduct, and I just want to also let those in the community know. Trustees have clearly defined duties and powers. As a board, trustees are responsible for promoting student achievement and well-being and for the effective stewardship of resources. The code of conduct is a covenant among trustees of the board. Trustees shall fulfill their duties loyally, faithfully, impartially, and in a manner that will inspire public confidence in the abilities and integrity of the board. And lastly, act with decorum and respect for the differing points of view of other trustees, staff, students, and of all stakeholders. So I would ask that that sense of decorum be observed by all parties in the room tonight. And I also recognize that it's a very difficult topic. So while our procedural bylaws speak to the possibility of questions from the public, there's that caveat, if time allows. And it's anticipated that trustees will have many questions this evening. So should there be time at the end of the meeting, perhaps we will be in a spot to take questions from the audience, but I don't anticipate that. And on that note, you're probably thinking, well, how can I ask my questions? And I would encourage you to continue to email trustees. And then the other opportunity is really with respect to the delegation nights that have been scheduled. There's 2 of them. They are May 8th and May 11th, where up to 25 delegations each will be invited to be heard. Following that, on Wednesday, May 17th, this item will come before the board for information, and up to 6 delegations can also be heard on that night. And then, if everything goes according to the timeline as proposed, Wednesday, June 7th, this item will be before the board for decision. And again, up to 6 delegations may be scheduled at that point in time. So that is a lot of information, but I would direct you to hdsb.ca, where the timeline is posted and links to where you can submit a request for a delegation. And I would just ask that you put as much detail as you can so that it can be ensured that a variety of perspectives and equity of opportunity be ensured. I really have no idea if we're going to have 1,000 requests or, the 50. So the more detail you can provide, the better will be. And I'm appreciative of that. So without further ado, that's all the process stuff I think I had. And I would like to invite Director Miller to make the presentation. We'll hold questions until the presentation is over. Thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Al Harrison, Oliver, and Graves. I'm going to make a few remarks. I will not make extensive remarks tonight, and the reason I will not make extensive remarks at the beginning of this is because this is yet another step in the process. There are still public delegation evenings to be heard. There's still a board meeting in which it is discussed for a time, and I will make more remarks at that point. I won't make any during the public delegations, but I don't want to make any kind of conclusive remarks this evening because we still have delegations to hear, and the community still has their opportunity to provide input into this process. I would say this. When we recommended to the Board of Trustees in October that we undertake a PAR in the City of Burlington, we did so with great caution, and we did so with trepidation. we understand what a PAR, accommodation reviews, and ultimately closures of schools can do to communities. We truly do understand that. I know that there's many that will disagree with our recommendation. I know that there's many that will attribute particular motivations as to why we've made that recommendation. I can tell you that the recommendation, when we initiated the PAR, was made because we believed that there's an issue in the city of Burlington in that all of our students in this city are not getting the same equity of opportunity as students throughout the rest of the board, including some of the larger schools within Burlington. And I say the same this evening. This recommendation that we've put forward, we believe, can help to resolve that issue. However, we understand completely that the final decision is the Board of Trustees, and the public and the trustees should be assured that we will implement the will of this Board of Trustees, regardless of it. And regardless of that decision, we recognize that we will have work to do. We'll have work to heal some divisiveness that has occurred in communities, in schools, and even perhaps with some of our staff. Regardless of what the decision is, we recognize that we'll have to do that. And we're prepared to do that work because that's our job. We also recognize the complexity and the challenges that this has placed on the entire community. Most of all, our students. Our students are why everyone in this room is here. Everyone in the inner table at Board of Trustees, everybody on the outer table, and all the gallery behind us. We're all here for the same purpose. So what I would say is that none of us can question the motivation of anyone else in this room, because we're here to try to make this better for students. And we will accept, as I said, obviously, whatever this is. At this point, this is the best recommendation that we believe will help resolve some of the issues and provide equity of opportunity for students in Burlington that they do have in other parts of this board, because we're the Halton District School Board. So I will do a presentation for about 20 minutes. I would ask trustees not to ask questions in that 20 minutes because the night is yours to ask questions, and let us get through the presentation. And then the rest of the evening, we've deliberately made it a pretty short presentation so that you will have the opportunity to ask questions of clarification. There is one caveat. We may not have the answer right at our fingertips for some of them. We will record those, get the answers, and we will get those back to the trustees, and we will state those answers at the board meeting on May 17th, whatever those may be. So if there's some that we can't get, as you can see from the work here, it's a hugely complex matter that we've dealt with, and we may not have all the answers at our fingertips. All right, so the first one is obviously the introductory page, Program and Accommodation Review, Burlington Secondary Students. The second is the vision of this board and the new multi-year plan. And I don't have to read these slides. This is what drove us. This is what drove us every part of the way to say, how can we do this for every single one of our students? Every single one. Not certain groups, not smaller groups, but every single student. This is what drove us in this whole process. The rationale for the PAR that we presented, as many of you know, there was provincial guidelines around a PAR process. And in those provincial guidelines, there's two possibilities: a shortened process, which is about 3 months, or a longer process, which is 6 to 7 months. We chose, obviously, the 6 to 7 month one, and we did that for two reasons: to give this the full credit it deserves in terms of looking at it, and to demonstrate our respect to the community that we're not trying to rush anything through. We're not trying to quickly get this done and dusted. We're trying to get through this in a way that is comprehensive, that we can get input from the entire community and work on it. There are 5 criteria within those guidelines, and our board policy, which we had to generate and was approved by this board last spring of 2016, had to reflect the provincial guidelines. And in that, there are 5 criteria for rationale for PAR. You are required to meet 1 of those 5. We met 2. the school or group of schools has declining enrollment or has experienced enrollment of less than 65. And the key here is a school or a group of schools. And the second one is a reorganization involving the school or group of schools to the enhanced program. We believed that those two criteria were met, hence we provided a recommendation to initiate a PAR. The second, this slide is about the utilization, and this is part of the criteria. You can see the utilization rates of these schools in Burlington. I don't have to spell them out. They're low. They're not ideal for a secondary school, and in some cases not even close for a secondary school to provide the same opportunity of programs and course selections, et cetera, for students in the regular stream of schools, whether it be academic or applied or even essential in some cases. So you can see the challenge right there. We have one school that is overutilized, Frank Hayden, and every other school is under. And this board, in their multi-year plan, one of the goals is 90% enrollment in our schools. We only have, on that list there, we only have one school that has achieved that. So it would be difficult for us to say we should not do a PAR or recommend a PAR to the Board of Trustees. In fact, one might make the argument perhaps it should have been done some time ago. So here are the concerns with small secondary schools. And again, I won't read them, but it's availability of required courses, course conflicts, and so on. As the Board of Trustees know, and many of the gallery knows, prior to entering into the formal PAR process, we did presentations at each of the schools, and we talked about the reasons why we were doing it, and these are the same reasons that we were doing, that we presented at that time, that there are challenges in small secondary schools. What are you doing?
I didn't realize myself. Drive. Go ahead.
Now you lost me.
No, you're then.
Is this where I was? Yeah. Okay. And so, therefore, those are the challenges. We also acknowledged at that time that there are advantages with smaller secondary schools. We know that. We know that it has more of sometimes a more inclusive, almost a village environment in those smaller schools. The challenge was we had, out of our 7 schools, we had 5 that were all small and another one below the 90%. So it's not so much that we're objecting to a small school or trying to rectify one situation. We had 5 schools. And it's, other than one other area of the board, it's the only area of the board where we were faced with that kind of circumstance. And in that other area, we have 2 secondary schools and 1 is a smaller school. So then we initiated the PARC process. I'm going to let Superintendent Podreberg talk a little bit about that because, he, as you around the table know, he was the chair of that process.
Thank you, Director Miller. The PARC process, similar to the broader PAR process, is rooted in our procedures, and we were sure to follow those. It included an orientation meeting, 7 working meetings. We originally had 4 set by policy. We added 3 additional at the request of PARC members, so that brought us to 7. We did 3 public meetings, the one at the beginning of the process, December 8th, and then we did the 2 public meetings just between the 3rd and the 4th working meeting. Throughout the process, we brought forward lots of data to PARC members, and that was public surveys, staff surveys, student surveys. All in all, we looked at over 50 different options around the 7 schools. And through a variety of discussions and more discussions on top of that, we did put forward 5 recommendations for the director's consideration. I will acknowledge, just is in most aspects of this process, they're difficult discussions, and the PARC was no different. There was not a sense from the outset that there would be a magic consensus. They worked together very well. We discussed lots of issues, but at the end of the day, there were 5 that we recommended and put forward for consideration. And I just want to note that the park members were 2 parents from each school. One was selected by the parent council, and the other through a random expression of interest from each school community. And so that gave us 14 parents. And throughout the process, our principals from the 7 schools were there to serve as a resource. But all in all, waded through lots of dialogue, lots of information, and really recognizing the complexity of the task.
And I would like to acknowledge the work of the Park Committee. It was a pretty remarkable commitment that those people made. In our policy, it's 4 meetings. We had 7 meetings, most of which went over the 2-hour time period. And I know that they were doing much work behind the scenes and having conversations. It was a huge commitment to this board and to our students. That people stepped up. I know there were disagreements, and I know that there will be disagreements amongst the park or the PAR committee to this final recommendation. It's important to note that the park's role was not to come up with the recommendation that's before you today. It never was, it never is. It's to provide recommendations that the board staff, and particularly the director, can consider. And it was also for staff to look at those considerations and determine whether they be modified or otherwise. So what are the highlights of the process? And maybe some would argue about the word highlights. The closure of 2 secondary schools, Lester B. Pearson and Robert Bateman High School. French immersion at Dr. Frank Hayden moving from, or being grandparented out and moving to M.M. Robinson. A change in the boundary between Nelson High School and Burlington Central High School. And then there was various program and placement moves. Essential would be moving to, those north of the QEW would be moving to M.M. Robinson, and the students currently in the Essential program at Bateman would be grandfathered at Nelson, or grandparented, I should say. There already is a CPP placement at M.M. Robinson, and there really should be an Essential. There's a synergy between the Essential programs and CPP programs, and currently M.M. Robinson, or CPP is not being a program but a placement, but there is currently no Essentials at M.M. Robinson. So this will recognize that synergy and make it consistent. And of course, it provides composite schools both in the north and the south, and so on. We will grandparent students wherever possible. And the last one, this came out of some conversations, but certainly at the park, it was a conversation for the last meeting and a wee bit of the meeting before that, have we explored magnet or theme schools to try to attract students to our system. And we have made a commitment to do that for one of our schools. But we'll be honest, we know of magnet and theme schools outside of our board that has attracted Halton students. They have attracted less than 30 Halton students, and they're all over the place. So there's not a great number of Halton students in the Peel board or the Toronto board or the Hamilton board in their magnet schools. So. Recommendation 1, the great challenge with Bateman is the catchment area. More than half the students currently at that school live outside the catchment area. In the regular, or not regular, in the English program, there are currently 283 students. They're augmented by IB in grade 9 and 10, and a wee bit in grade 11 and 12, but the IB students in grade 11 and 12 have their own, they have to follow the IB directions and so on. And the Pavement projections continue to show a decline. They haven't stabilized at this point, and they're not growing. We have many, many regional programs in Bateman, and I think the gallery and the trustees need to know this. Monday morning, Superintendent Etoff and I met with the Bateman staff, a very difficult meeting. These are people that are dedicated to students. These are people that have worked their working lives to work with kids and make their lives better and help these kids and support them. And we know that. And the first comment I made to them was, this recommendation does not reflect their work or the work of our staff in that school. Not at all. Bateman serves their students very well. It is close to Nelson Secondary School, and it will provide increased program opportunities and choice for both Nelson and Bateman students. Recommendation 2, again, Pearson has had a declining enrollment for some time. It's very close to M.M. Robinson. It is a smallish high school to begin with. Its on-the-ground capacity is less than 700. There used to be a porta-pack on there, which allowed for additional number of students up to around 1,000, just over 1,000. The porta-pack has been closed for some time, and it's continuing to be in decline in terms of enrollment. It provides very limited program choice for students and limited opportunities for extracurriculars. By increasing the numbers at MMR, we will provide more opportunities for both the MMR kids and the Nelson students, or Pearson, sorry. And moving forward, there'll be a communication plan, implementation of school integration process, transition planning for all program and placement changes. And I just want to comment on transition. It's been mentioned many, many times, and I want to assure the public and the trustees that there are students at Bateman that have great challenges with transition. And for some of them, they have been in several schools prior to getting to Robert Bateman. And getting to Robert Bateman provided some stability for those students. It provided them a place for some years. We fully recognize that. We will also grandparent those students so that they move together as a group, which is, there's a little awkwardness in the talking because I'm saying we will. It's all dependent on the Board of Trustees' decision. So let's assume that this, so I can talk like that. We recognize that there are transition challenges. We fully recognize that. And we will, it is one of the reasons that we have suggested for Robert Bateman, or recommended for Robert Bateman, that the closure actually takes place 2 years from now as opposed to next year. So to provide those opportunities for transitions of those students. And there will be facility improvements on both the impacted schools, ongoing monitoring of the implementation, and we will have, just so people are aware, it's in the report that it's prescribed what the integration and implementation or transition committee is. It involves the superintendent, SEAC, principals of both schools, various other members of staff, and so on. But we will also have a coordinating superintendent responsible so that they can oversee the whole thing. That process would begin if the board chooses, if the board decides to approve this recommendation. I think that's about all for our presentation. We'll leave it open for questions now. I don't know if Dom or Scott have anything to say. No, Dom. I want to thank you, trustees, again, the gallery, and all senior staff, and in particular to the park for the work they've done on this. We absolutely recognize that there are great challenges with this. We absolutely recognize that there are many that disagree with this recommendation. And we wholeheartedly respect everyone's right and obligation to disagree with this and put together their position as to why they disagree with it. So with that, I will be quiet. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. So the speakers list is initiated. So I'll start at the top. And as the trustee is speaking and asking your question, again, if you have a question or comment on that topic thread, just throw up your hand and we'll keep a supplementary list, okay? So Trustee Collard.
Thank you, and this has quite a lengthy preamble, I apologize, but it needs to be put into context. Option 23E proposes closing Bateman and moving the students to Nelson Central and MM Robinson at a cost of about $12 million in renovations just to replicate many of the amenities that already exist at Bateman. It would not provide access to an indoor swimming pool, which is part of the weekly curriculum of the students in self-contained classes, nor would it offer the commercial-grade kitchen that Bateman provides. The report speaks of creating composite schools. Bateman is already a composite school. Not only does this option leave Burlington with a shortfall of 411 pupil places, it does not provide all of the students in South Burlington with equitable opportunities. Aldershot remains underutilized with about 350 English and 100 French immersion students. Central gains the IB program, which does nothing to provide additional breadth to the English program, and would result in about 425 English, 100 French immersion, and 175 IB and pre-IB students. Nelson ends up over capacity, requiring portables, with about 950 English, 300 French immersion, 60 gifted, and 150 self-contained students. The report suggests that Aldershot would become a magnet school without providing any details. With Aldershot being in the most southwest corner of Halton, it would have to be a pretty strong magnet in order to attract students from other parts of Burlington, let alone Oakville, Milton, or Halton Hills. This seems to be the most expensive and least sustainable option and does not demonstrate much in terms of innovative solutions. Please explain how this proposal provides balance and equity of opportunity for students in South Burlington.
Thank you, Trustee Collard, for the question. Part of that answer is in the report, and with what we have said. What your I'll start in certain parts of it. Let's start with Aldershot. As the recommendation is we have not provided many details because we've said that that's what we're going to explore and investigate. And so will it attract students from Burlington? It depends on what that report comes back in February, what that report comes back. It may attract kids from Oakville, may attract kids from Hamilton. It depends on what that is. I do know magnet schools in other places are in difficult spots as well. There are schools in the Tsb, the Peel District School Board that are magnet schools that are also in areas that are far away from other places, so, and they seem to attract students. So that's the Aldershot part of the way. Let's talk about, I'll address your, how does this create equity of opportunity? Well, it certainly does provide it for students in MM Robinson, and it does for students currently attending Pearson. It certainly does it for students in the English program at Bateman and the English program at Nelson. It increases it, and although the move of IB to Burlington Central, you've suggested that it does not provide anything around equity. At grade 9 and 10 is pre-IB, and those students are all in the same program, so it provides more opportunities and less class conflicts in grades 9 and 10. Does it do much in grade 11 and 12? It may. One of our other schools with IB in the north, we've used blended classes between IB and students in the English program, and there are some blended classes. So it has, in that experience, it has increased the breadth of class opportunities for both the IB and the regular students. So it can. It doesn't address the enrollment pressures on Aldershot. It does address the enrollment pressures on Frank Hayden by decreasing it and sending those students to, the French immersion students to MM Robinson. Does it cause Nelson to be oversubscribed? It does for a period of time. In secondary schools, that is not necessarily an unusual thing. Secondary schools have an ability to absorb more than the on-the-ground capacity because of the way schools are timetabled with single lunches or going to double lunches and so on. So I would argue that it is providing equity, more equity of opportunity for at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 out of the 6 schools that have those challenges. And a possibility for a 7th if Aldershot's magnet or themed school proves to be something that can attract students.
Thank you. So as we know that most of the breadth of program is actually available in grades 11 and 12, grade 9 and 10 are more rigorous in terms of what students can select. So it's where they need the options in grade 11 and 12 that they might have access to those and might not with the IB program. So we need to consider that as well. And with respect to double lunches, I know that that is not favored in secondary schools because that doesn't allow for teacher collaboration time at lunch, and it also doesn't allow for clubs and extracurriculars to take place at lunch hour, which is a vital part of a school community. So I would like those your comment on those 2 points. Thanks.
On the first one, you're right. It might not. There will be, out of this report or this recommendation, if it's approved, unintended consequences of it. That may or may not be one. I cannot say definitively that it will provide that in grade 11 and 12. I can say with the increased numbers of the school, at Central I'm talking about, I can say definitively in grades 9 and 10, it will provide, right now students in grades 9 and 10, if they're in the English track, have one option. If they're in the French immersion track, they have one option. If they're in the English track, they have 2 options. With a greater number of grade 9 and 10s, they will, at least the grade 9 and 10 students will have more options from which to draw from because there'll be greater numbers. So right now it's kind of fixed on what they can do. But I don't disagree with you. It may not do that at grade 11 and 12. What was the second part of the question around? Oh, the double lunch. Yes, many principals prefer a single lunch. And I would say I, as a principal, preferred a single lunch when I was a secondary school principal because it does allow for some of those things. It does allow for some collaboration. Double lunches, however, do not preclude collaboration. They do not preclude intramurals, and they can be in for a short period of time to address accommodation issues. I would say that probably most principals in our system prefer a single lunch, though.
Okay, Trustee Pappen.
Thank you, through the chairs, to Director Miller, Superintendent Podraveric, and Manager Ronzella. I was at a school council meeting for Pearson recently, and I learned that Pearson was built as an overflow school for M.M. Robinson. And I can actually say I'm old enough to remember when M.M. Robinson was bursting at the seams in the early 70s. But Pearson has been experiencing declining enrollment for several years, and that is projected to continue to 2026 and beyond. I think we need to look at the characterization of enrollment at Pearson. What is the reason for this declining enrollment? A reduction in the number of feeder schools, perhaps? Pearson now has only 1.5 feeder schools compared to 7 at Hayden. This has created an unfortunate situation for Pearson. One need only look at the change in enrollment since Hayden came online to see how it has reduced Pearson's numbers. Pearson lost only 10 students from 2010-2011. Furthermore, the change from 2015-2016 is only 11 less students. It is inappropriate to close a school based on a reduction of 11 students year over year when there are many options which are available to boost utilization. There are many factors that have led to Pearson's declining enrollment. Have we, as the Halton District School Board, contributed to this low enrollment by decisions that have been made in the past, such as feeder schools, splitting cohorts, and realigning boundaries?
through the chair to Trustee Pappen. The issue with Pearson has been one where when the board decided to open Hayden, there was an extensive boundary review process undertaken, which involved all the school communities. And just to reiterate, at the time, Lester B. Pearson, the only area that was redirected to Hayden was the Kilbride rural students. And the basis for that redirection to Hayden from Pearson was proximity. There was concern from that community that you're driving by a couple of high schools in order to get to Pearson, and that it would be prudent to attend that school. So that's one factor. So that's one of the reasons why, and that's been the only change that we're aware of, unless there was something prior to that in terms of Pearson's enrollments. Because at the time, Alton was redirected to MMR, Nelson student, the Millcroft area was attending Nelson, and Orchard was going to Bateman. So as part of the process for the Dr. Frank Hayden, there was an extensive public consultation with the school communities. Now, we've seen lower than projected enrollment coming out of Lester B. Pearson for a number of reasons. There have been lower extended FI enrollments going to the school from Sir Ernest McMillan, and again, that school has also been declining in enrollment. There's also been declining enrollment at CH Norton over time because of, again, it was accommodating students in the Alton Village community, and once Alton Village opened up, students were redirected there. And also, we're seeing a decline in people, students coming out of grade 8 in terms of CH Norton. There's been a real decline in the grade 8s choosing to attend either MMR and Lester B. Pearson. So we're losing that attraction for whatever reason. So that's also contributed to the lower projected enrollments at Lester B. Pearson. So, the board did have a boundary change once Hayden opened. It was the Kilbride students. There might have been 80 to 100 kids coming out of that area. But in terms of any other changes, there weren't any over the last number, especially when Hayden was open. Be glad to answer any other questions.
And I just want to make a comment here. There is a finite number of students, and this is the challenge. There's 7 secondary schools and only a finite number of students. We have heard lots of talk around intensification and neighborhoods turning over. The situation that we're facing in Burlington has been around for some time. It has been around since the 1990s, declining enrollment in certain areas. And our projections, and our planning department does speak with the city of Burlington, indicates that this is continued, this is expected to continue. And this is the problem. So in drawing the boundaries, and maybe previous decisions caused this or caused that or whatever else, but there's a bottom line. There's still only X number of students. And we have 7 schools serving that X number of students. And so no matter how you change the boundaries, there's going to be low utilization in some of those schools. I was negligent in mentioning that we have a number of staff here tonight, and we will be turning to them for some answers and so on. And I would ask staff, for the public's purpose, to introduce yourself as you, if I could call upon you. Thanks.
Just further to your question as well, the park looked at many options around Pearson, and could we simply redirect students into it? Option 4 was essentially that. It was one of the final options, but as Director Miller notes, it leaves unanswered questions elsewhere. It leaves MM still very under capacity, and so any of the options always left. It just left shuffling in bigger issues elsewhere. But I want to say, in those 50 options we looked at, we looked at many with that scenario of, could we just redirect more into it or redraw boundaries, and we didn't find as viable an option.
Thank you. Trustee Daniele.
Thank you. Through you, Ms. Demchairs, to Director Miller. Can we go back to slide 4 for a moment, please? Is that possible? 4, please. I'm going to direct my initial questions around Bateman, because I was very surprised to see it drop from 95% in 2010 to 59% in 2016 and thereafter. So I'm wondering if you could tell us for the record what caused that drop. And then my secondary question is, the one I intended to start with, is you've chosen to recommend Bateman closing, but given what we heard earlier from Trustee Collett around everything that Bateman has, the cost of the renovations and the geographic location to Nelson, I am wondering why you chose Bateman to recommend closing and then rebuilding all of that in Nelson instead of closing Nelson and moving that over to Bateman. If you could just help me understand that, I would greatly appreciate it.
In terms of the first question, the reason why the sudden drop or the significant drop was the opening of Dr. Frank Halton. The Orchard community was at that time directed to Bateman, Robert Bateman High School, and once the new school and the boundaries were approved, were redirected to Dr. Frank. That's why you saw the dramatic decrease in enrollment at the school.
And I'll address the Nelson Bateman question. You're right, close proximity, and Trustee Collard is also correct in that there are various, Bateman has it all. It's got a full service school. So and it would cost money to replicate that at Nelson High School. It's a twofold kind of answer. The simplest part of the answer is with respect to the catchment areas. The catchment area of Nelson, currently there's approximately 1,000 students in that school. And if you'll see on there, they're about 75% capacity, and they vary between now and 2026, hover in around high 70s, all the way into the 80s and so on. I'm not sure how a director could bring a report to the Board of Trustees recommending the closure of a school with about 1,000 students in it, and when its enrollment is so high. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer, yes, Bateman does provide fantastic services for the students. There's no question. Can these be replicated elsewhere? I believe they can. I have full confidence in our staff. I believe that we have a very professional body of educational assistants and teachers that work for us, and the work that's done at Bateman could be replicated at many sites. It does afford us the opportunity to build a purpose-built facility for students with special needs, particularly those placed in CPP. And I want it noted that there's been some talk that, you're just going to build a wing and put CPP kids in a wing. That is not the intention. The intention would be to have these students fully integrated into the school, the life of the school, structurally and with the other students. So that would be looked at. And yes, it does cost money. However, by closing 2 schools, there's significant savings in operating costs over a period of time. There are proceeds of disposition at some point, and when you close a couple of schools, you also have the opportunity to apply for provincial funding for additions or renovations. There's no guarantee the province will give it to you, but closing 2 schools makes the possibility of doing that greater. So I would just, in a 5-year period, if these 2 schools were ultimately to be the ones that the board approved for closure, in a 5-year period, the operation for both those schools is approximately $10 million. It's about $2 million per year. So, yes, I understand that there's costs to doing that to Nelson. And as I said, it does afford us to build a purpose-built facility. The other aspect of that is the money would just not, there's just not money being spent on Nelson. It would be also at Robinson, as we would have 2 sites, fully composite schools. Right now, we have 1 fully composite school in Burlington, and we would be recommending that we go to 2.
Trustee Gerbentz has a follow-on to that.
Yes, thank you, Trustee Al Harrison. And thank you very much for this report. Just with regards to the catchment and there's 1,000 students at Nelson. So Robert Bateman and Nelson are 1.9 kilometers apart. Robinson and Pearson are 1.9 kilometers apart. Therefore, you've said in the report that walkability to Robinson for Pearson, it basically fits almost completely within walkability. There isn't a lot of transportation changes. So if Nelson were to close, would we be seeing a similar amount of students that would not be needing transportation to go to Bateman? Do they basically fit within the same or similar area?
It's a little crooked here. The transportation boundary maps are in the school information profiles, and that there will be some students eligible for transportation from Bateman to Nelson. So there will be some residual students being provided transportation. And if you look at option 23E, and I think information has been provided, we are looking at probably about 232 additional students being transported as a result of implementation, once it's fully implemented. And compared to the no closure process, there's still going to be some student movements, about 131 students or whatnot. But most importantly, and we did get this from HSTS, what's the estimated cost if we were to implement 23E? And because of how we run buses, or HSTS runs buses, they share buses, they split buses, their costs would, range in about $32,000 to $35,000. So there's not going to be, once it's all, once the grandparenting is done and whatnot, but ultimately the costs are not going to be excessive because of the weight of integrating students. And most importantly, and one of the things that we want to say is that some of the special needs children, CPP kids, will now have a shorter bus distance as a result of the 2 sites. So those residing north of the QEW would go to MMR, and therefore from a 40 to 50-minute bus ride will now be shortened to 20 minutes. So, there is a time benefit as a result of that. So, but overall, the cost for implementing 23E is about $31,000 to $35,000.
Sorry, we are. Yep, okay. So Trustee Harvey Hope, and then we'll go to Trustee Graves. Okay, so perhaps they will reflect your question.
So I had the same question. So Trustee Gerbentz asked whether or not if you closed Nelson and moved them to Bateman, whether or not Nelson's walk-to zone would be overlapped with Bateman's. I think that was the actual question. You answered the opposite,
Okay.
which was Bateman and
Sorry.
Bateman closing and going
The
to
answer to
Nelson.
the question is essentially yes. There are students, it's essentially yes. In Bateman, there are students in the southeast and Burlington that would be eligible for busing. And in the Nelson catchment area, there are kids in the west of Nelson who would be eligible for busing. But by and large, it's essentially a wash.
Thank you. My question was along actually those same lines as well. Piece of information that I'm interested in, because when we look at the catchments and the boundaries, we realize that because of programming and so on, things can be shifted around a little bit. What I'm interested in is, because I'm a math person, a Venn diagram of the two schools. So if you can imagine the walking catchment of Bateman and the walking catchment of Nelson. And there's going to be sort of three separate sets of students in there, ones who can only walk to Bateman, ones who can only walk to Nelson, and then in the middle, ones who are within walking distance of both. Is it possible to get that information to us, how those walking areas overlap?
Sure, we can do that. Obviously can't do it this evening, but we can get that to trustees. Yes.
That'd be very helpful, thank you.
Okay, Trustee Collard.
Trustee Graves, in answer to your question, I've already requested that map. Yeah, okay.
Excellent. Okay, moving on then to Trustee Gray.
Thank you very much. And through the co-chairs, Oliver and Al Harrison, this question to Manager Renzella. I'm using appendix number 4, where we've got the data that is arrived at through option 23E. That would be the last page in appendix 4. Right, thank you. I note that through the option 23E that has been recommended, that the on-the-ground capacity, we have, through this recommendation, 3 schools that in fact will be over capacity, and 2 schools that will be under capacity, but in very healthy range of 87 and 88. So, for example, Aldershot will be 87, Burlington Central will be 88. The 3 schools that will be over will be Robinson at 106. And I'm looking at the data from 2020. I'm giving a few years, just a couple years for us to settle and see what the projection would result in. I'm looking at Hayden at 124, Nelson at 116, and Robinson at 106. My question is this: what is the optimal amount that any school should be running at? What is our comfort zone, in other words, in terms of overcapacity? Earlier, we heard from the director that schools can absorb overcapacity through doubling up lunches, adding portables perhaps. There's any means by which you can assume greater capacity. But when we look at being overcapacity, I think of the other side, where we have then perhaps we're increasing the limitations on students to be involved in maybe some extracurricular activities, field trips, and so on and so forth. So there's an upside and a downside to being over capacity. What is our tolerance level for overcapacity? What's a comfort to us? And in this recommendation, we've put 3 schools over capacity, and I'm just wanting to hear a little bit more about your comfort zone.
To Trustee Gray, you're right. There are pluses and minuses with overcapacity. High schools do have an ability to be quite to grow much larger than, say, elementary schools. The question becomes, you weigh up the advantages versus the disadvantages, or the pluses and the minuses. And depending, obviously, you asked about tolerance. It's difficult to say what that is. I mean, most of our schools, we would be allowed to put 12 portables on site. Not them all, but most of them, we would be allowed to put a minimum of 12 portables on site. And, you know, a lot of people would say, well, that's not healthy. That's an indication that there's an issue with the overcapacity. At secondary school, portables are not the same issue as they are at elementary schools. The kids are in for a class, then they're back in the school, et cetera, and so on. So the ability to absorb portables on secondary sites is much more efficient and much better than it is at an elementary level. So once a school becomes unmanageable, it's difficult to say exactly what our capacity is to absorb overcapacity. But if a school is consistently year after year after year for several years at 120%, say, that's an issue. It would have to be addressed because it's year after year after year. These will decline over time as well. And most schools have an overcapacity for a period of time. And I could use Milton Elementary Schools as an example. Many of the Milton Elementary Schools, even 4 or 5 years ago, were well over 1,000 students. There still are some with over 1,000 students, but many of those that were over 1,000 students are now stabilizing in terms of the population of those schools. Some of those schools in Oakville, the same situation. Some of our secondary schools in Oakville have experienced the same thing. So the minuses are, you're right, around extracurriculars, co-curriculars. Does every kid get an opportunity in a small school? A student wants to be on the basketball team, or they want to be in musical theater or whatever else. Their ability to be on that is greater than it is in a larger high school because there's less competition. The challenge becomes, though, in a smaller school, they may not have a basketball team, or they may not have a musical theater, so therefore no kids can then go into it. So there are, I think Trustee Collard mentioned about intramurals. Intramurals are a way to provide opportunities for students that aren't on sports teams or other musical opportunities and so on, so co-curriculars and extracurriculars. But the big thing about these large schools is it does afford schools to provide more programs, more courses, more opportunities, and that kids can pursue the pathways that they need to do to graduate from high school. So it's a difficult question to answer because every school would be different in terms of its ability to take that capacity on. If the space is tight, the property's tight, their ability to put portables on site or absorb all those kids is less. If it's a larger school with more space, there's also that opportunity. And there's also, and we've done this in North Burlington, we applied for and received funding from the province for additions when it appeared that the capacity was going to continue to be over capacity for several years. That's always an option that can be employed.
Trustee Collard has a follow-up.
Yes, on that same thread, when we talk about Aldershot High School and Burlington Central High School, we need to remember that both of those schools are partitioned high schools, where the actual high school building also houses grade 7 and 8 students, and that number is not reflected in the capacity of the school because we have partitioned it. So where it looks like we might be approaching 75, 78, 80% capacity, we have not really approached that in those schools because we have partitioned a section of those schools off. Aldershot actually would have capacity for nearly 900 secondary students and will only have half that in their school. And when we compare the number of students at Nelson, Robinson, and Hayden, you can combine Aldershot and Central and still not fill one of those other 3 schools.
Can I make a comment? I would agree with that. I agree with that point. We have similar circumstances in Halton Hills. We have one very large school and one small school. So it's, but you're right.
Okay, Trustee Oliver?
Thank you. I have kind of a follow-up along those lines. So given that Burlington Central and Aldershot have been, the school facilities have been filled by adding the grade 7 and 8s, and initially Burlington Central was a recommended school, I wonder what factors swayed us away from considering those two and possibly a consolidation of those two and considering another school.
When we looked at this, and when we looked at all the data, all the public input, and everything we heard, read, and saw in what we were looking at, there was no question that Lester B. Pearson was a small school, and it was going to continue to be a small school. Robert Bateman is not a particularly small school at this point. It's well below capacity, though. Its catchment area is, in fact, the number of students that come out of the catchment area is, in fact, the lowest of any of the schools in Burlington. And we were there were a number of regional programs in Bateman that were boosting the enrollment. Regional programs, as I've said, regional programs and regional placements that helped build the capacity of Robert Bateman and did much for those students. There is a CPP placement at Robinson with the intent, it started 4 years ago, as I said, with the intent that that would grow. It would grow from the students north of the QEW. We were not going to move any students out of the south to go there and transition them in, but new students would attend there. And CPP there's no essential program at Robinson, so we would have to, I believe, put an essential level program into Robinson so that we could provide a fully composite school in the north and one in the south. That would have meant that we would have been taking more students out of Bateman in order to do that. So you have the decline in the catchment area of Robert Bateman, and you have the number of students that were some of those regional programs would be shifting a little bit. Now, why we didn't bring Aldershot and Central together, why we consider that way, Aldershot is our furthest, most western school. In fact, it's virtually on the Hamilton-Wentworth border. We would have either, say, we closed Burlington Central or we closed Aldershot, say it was Burlington Central. We would have had more numbers, no question, in Aldershot. We would have had kids from Burlington Central being bused over there. But the Burlington Central kids would have been split. They would have been bused, some to Aldershot and some to Nelson, based on it. They all would not have been bused to Nelson, to Aldershot. The other challenge around that, you know, as I've said, the two primary parameters that we've used are the most significant, by far the most significant, but they're not the only factors that we had to look at, because you're asking questions about walkability, you're asking questions about transit, so you know that there's other factors involved in this. The other factors is, if it was Burlington Central closed, there would have been approximately 12 kilometers between Nelson High School and Aldershot High School, and we would not have had a very geographically balanced number of schools in the south. If Aldershot had been closed, we would not have had something in the west. It kind of serves its own community in that way. And I know that there are challenges with transitioning our students with special needs. I know that. But we have students in other parts of the board that have different kinds of challenges, socioeconomic challenges and so on. I don't want to talk about who's the most vulnerable, but there would be challenges in transitioning those students as well. So it comes back to there's a finite number, and we had to make a recommendation based on where we thought the lines should be drawn. And so that's where it came from.
Trustee Gerbens.
Thank you. So looking at Appendix 4, page 1, which is the current scenario, Dr. Frank J. Hayden, over the next number of years, if nothing is done, it rises to, in 2021, to 1850. So the recommendation is to move the French immersion program from Dr. Frank J. Hayden to Robinson. Of course, those are both of my schools, and I've heard from a number of parents from the elementary level whose children are French immersion students, and many say that, or threaten, perhaps is the word, that they will demit from French immersion so that their children can stay at Hayden, is there a number of students that need to go to Robinson in order to make Hayden truly functional over the next few years?
First of all, there is not a specific number. The challenge with that, I know you have heard from some parents, and I have heard from some parents of the French immersion parents in Hayden, that if they are moving to Robinson, they will not go. I also heard if we closed Central, they would go to the Catholic system or the private system. I heard if we closed Aldershot, they'd go to the Catholic system. I've heard if we closed Bateman, those kids would go to the Catholic system, or the IB kids would go to Oakville. So there's all those comments out there. To take those into account in this process would be difficult. In fact, it would be impossible, because we don't know if people will actually follow through with those or whether they won't. So we felt that the French immersion, grandparenting the current students at Frank Hayden, will allow them to finish, and in 2018 start the grade 9 French immersion program. And there would be no grade 9 French immersion program at Frank Hayden. And so the question becomes, for parents and students' choice at that, do they want French? If they want French, the school they'll have to go to for French immersion is Robinson. Some, no question, will choose they want to go to Hayden and will choose to opt out. We have that now in our schools. We've had that in other parts of the board. There's also the factor that when we build new schools, as our coterminous board has found out, when new schools are built, there's usually increases in enrollment. Parents and kids want to go to a new building. And we've seen it in every time we've built a new secondary school, and I know our coterminous board is saying, but over time, it stabilizes because people make choices based on program. So the answer to your question about a number, don't know what the number is, because we don't know how that will play out, and we couldn't possibly predict what that would be. If people really want French immersion and their children or their children want French immersion, then that's still an option for them, because it is an optional area too, right? So go ahead.
Just a question: if French immersion parents decide to not follow the plan that you have, how long will we wait before going to a plan B?
To you, Trustee Gebrants, it's a good question. We don't know how long. How long has, rhetorically, how long has it been recommended on the LTAP that we should do an accommodation review in Burlington? It's been there for a while. So, so it's in the section on monitoring it so that we're on top of it the whole time, and we can see that. And there are areas of monitoring that we've recognized there's still challenges. The Aldershot enrollment, the Burlington Central FI enrollment, the Aldershot FI enrollment, the Frank Hayden overall enrollment, the Nelson enrollment. We need to continue to monitor these. We're under no illusions that we have found the exact perfect solution to all the conundrums that are out there. And I'm not of the opinion that there is an absolute perfect solution for that conundrum, because population shift and so on. But our recommendation is what we believe is the best one at this point. As I've said earlier, I'm sure there are many, many people that disagree with that.
Thank you. I have Trustee Daniele, then Trustee Harvey Hope with follow-up questions.
Thank you. And I just want to reiterate the concerns that have been raised by Trustee Gabans. When I look at Appendix 4 and I look at the numbers, I see Frank Hayden going from 139% utilization now to 124% in 2020 after this takes hold. And so I do have a concern that if you get more growth in that area, or those FI students demit, you're already at 125 in our planned projections. So one of the things we'll really need to see is a very good monitoring plan for this. That's, for me, that's a huge red flag right there. I'm very concerned about the 124 is the minimum that we're going to be, but there is the potential for further growth as well as the FI students demitting.
I don't disagree. And that's hence the reason that we're going to monitor it, right? So.
We'll go to Trustee Harvey Hope, then Trustee Pappen.
Not to flog a dead horse, but the concern I have is we have a maximum number that can attend that building now. And even if we went to a 2-lunch scenario, if you had everybody demit now, we're into a Plan B, Plan C. It would not be a case of monitoring. It would be a question of then what? So we have taken that into account? Because at 1,600, you can't go much higher. I mean, grade 11 and 12 only have 1 credit each year, but the grade 10s are more of an issue.
French immersion, sorry. If the students all demit and stay in, yes, we have taken that into account, and that's as much as we are able to. But as I go back to reiterate what I said to Trustee Grebenz, if we base this recommendation on the assumptions that students may or may not go around the entire, it would have been very difficult to come up with any recommendation, because as I've said, lots of parents have said to us that if this particular school was closed, they were going to the coterminous board, or they were going to private, or they were going to wherever. And is there a possibility that parents will demit from FI and go to just remain at Hayden? Absolutely, that's a possibility. But it's equally possible that they chose French immersion because they want to be in French immersion, and the school of choice for a French immersion program is MM Robinson. That's equally possible. Because I think we've just done a program viability study that will be implemented, well, it's being implemented now, and what we heard from parents that choose French immersion is they choose it because of language. They choose it because they want their kids in French. So I think that it's just as possible that they will not demit and they will go to MM Robinson, because what high school students want and what we want high school students to have is we want them to have the best possible opportunities once they leave our board. And many recognize that a second language is a valuable asset to have as they leave the board. And if they really believe that, and many do, most do, they will go to MM Robinson.
Thank you. Trustee Pappen, then Trustee Reynolds.
Thank you. Through the chair to Director Miller, my follow-up has to do with the same thing with French immersion and Hayden being at capacity, and the inability to put more portables on that property. And once we've closed a school, like, what are we going to do? Because, if they're developing at a great rate, we may not be able to buy more land to build another school.
Through the chairs to Trustee Pappen. Again, we're still looking at 2 years out, 2018, before things may be implemented, depending on the decision of trustees. We'll start to get a better idea of what is going to happen at that school. And again, in terms of monitoring, I just want to reiterate that we can continue, as you're well aware, have the long-term accommodation plan, which is our monitoring mechanism to see what's going on and what's happening in schools. The capacity of the school right now is 12 portables. In terms of whether or not we can increase the capacity is a question that I defer to Superintendent Cullen, but it does not preclude the opportunity for this board to apply for an addition to Frank Hayden, like was done for Craig Hilberger, that the school was undersized when it was built, and the board applied to the ministry for a 10-room addition. The same opportunity exists here as well. So, we are monitoring it, and there are other opportunities.
And I would like to refer to Superintendent Cullen for his comments on our ability to increase the capacity of that school.
Through the chair, to the trustees and the community. The issues at Hayden at the moment are typically on secondary schools, we apply for and permit 12 portables. And the reason for that, in the building code, there's a restriction around the firefighting capabilities of having 12 portables in a cluster on a site, and anything beyond that requires some extra effort work on our part. So the 12 is fairly common. Once we exceed the 12, we have to put in fire hydrants, some additional parking, a few issues like that. One of the things at Hayden, believe it or not, is actually the parking. There's parking there for the community center, library, and the high school. And under the current interpretation, each one of those users of the site has had to conform to the local parking requirements on the site as though they were standalone. So the shared time shifting and use around parking hasn't necessarily been incorporated into the local bylaws and their review of the parking issue. So that would be one of the issues that we potentially have to look at. Most of the other things that are required on site would be a washroom requirement, again, a building code requirement, and access to the site. So we've seen secondary schools with 20, 22, numbers of that nature on some of our secondary schools in the past. And without going through the formal process, I couldn't give you a definitive answer at the moment, but it has been done on other sites in our system and other systems around the province.
Okay, thank you. Over to Trustee Reynolds, and then to first-time speaker Oliver, Trustee Oliver.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to my trustees who have been asking great questions, some of which I had on my own list. So one of the concerns I have with respect to this topic here is regarding whether boundary changes were considered. We talked about removing a program from Hayden to decrease utilization. Was that a consideration? And if it was, what feedback had you received from the community regarding that?
Boundary specific to Hayden? Yeah. We did look at choices where French immersion was removed to offer relief to Hayden, or we looked at redirecting boundaries. We obviously landed here. Part of that was feedback. There was, once people are in a school, they want to stay there. They like Hayden, they want to stay. But we also, it didn't garner the favor. We thought also we would improve the French immersion numbers at Robinson. That was a bonus in this as well. But we didn't, there were many options that had the boundaries redrawn, but it, just through our disseminations, they didn't come forward in terms of the parks final options. You wouldn't see one there. They fell off for a variety of reasons, and a lot of that just had to do with people choosing. Immersion is more of a program of choice versus the other one being not, and that's the home school necessarily.
I think if you look at the status quo scenario, 7B, where we didn't close any school, that option was presented. There are some challenges in the context of, with the reorganization, there's a lot of moves happening still, and you are affecting a lot of elementary school communities in that case. And at the same time, MMR enrollment is still way below capacity in that case. But notwithstanding anything else, I think from the overall discussion, the question was, in order to move Hayden's boundaries, you have to move the English elementary school and French immersion boundary at the same time. So the question is that the appropriate way, or do we just move a program? So I think we looked at moving the French immersion program.
Trustee Gray.
I just wanted to add to my colleagues here that in moving the French immersion program from Hayden to Robinson, and therefore increasing the size of the French immersion program there, you need a critical mass to provide programming, and it actually would improve the programming because more courses could be offered. I believe I read that in the report, and I took note of that because I know that to be a very, very important aspect of the French immersion program, having some choice in the courses that the French immersion programming is offered in.
I'm going to ask Associate Director Bogue to address the programming in general, but specifically that.
Sure, thanks through Madam Chairs to Trustee Gray and to the rest of the trustees. At our French immersion sites, our kids are required to take 10 credits in French. And so Trustee Gray is correct. If we've got more kids within a given grade, 4 of those courses are actually courses in French language. The other courses are up to the schools to determine what courses those are. And there's some consistency from site to site, but there's also some variance, and it's also based on teacher expertise, what a school can offer. So if you've got 30 grade 10s, for example, you've only got one group, one cohort, you've got you're more limited in terms of what you can offer, and you only have one of each. But if you've got 60 kids in grade 10, you might have 2 different optional courses, for example, in a certain time slot, so that kids would have some choice and variety. So those numbers in the immersion, because kids tend to travel as a cohort, it also, not only does it provide more choice, but it also allows you to mix kids up so they're not traveling with the exact same group of kids each day as well. So that's the added advantage for larger numbers in the FI.
Thank you. Trustee Collard, then Trustee Oliver on this topic.
Thank you. In my community, we have 3 dual-track schools in the north, in the Orchard. All 3 of the elementary schools in the Orchard are dual-track. It's an extremely popular program, French immersion. At some point in time, I think we've leveled off, but at one point we were getting about 80% of students picking French immersion in one of my schools. The concern from my community, because we represent about 40% of the population at Hayden, was twofold, because the communities were going to either be split into 3 different schools, or they were going to be split into 2 different schools. Splitting one of the schools because the students come from south of Upper Middle Road to go to the northernmost school in the Orchard. That one was particularly painful for a number of families. And so I'm very split on how I feel about this. Part of the solution is very difficult for me because I know that all of the families with students in French immersion are very disappointed to see the program going. But all of the English program students from the Orchard are able to stay. And so I have to be able to celebrate that at the same time as expressing my disappointment. And I'm also grateful for the length of the phase out, that students that are at Hayden will get to graduate from Hayden. So as I said, I have my disappointment and my moment of celebration for the students that live in the Orchard on this issue. And I do like to see our programs become more robust. So that leads me to my question about Aldershot and Central, each of whom have about 100 students in their French immersion program. And I'm wondering exactly how healthy that is to have 25 students per grade.
I'll answer that in a sec. I just want to comment on that, and it's kind of related to what Trustee Gray said and Associate Director Bogue. Yeah, it's difficult for the Orchard, those that have chosen French immersion, but we believe it was a better solution than moving kids in the mandatory program out. They've chosen optional, and they've chosen French immersion for a reason, and there's already French immersion at Robinson, so it will be a far more robust program. Now, the answer to your question, There are challenges with that that we've recognized in our report. Both Burlington Central and Aldershot have small French immersion cohorts. Central is projected to increase somewhat, and Burlington Central is relatively stable. It would be much preferable to have them both bigger or perhaps combined into one school. We considered that. We considered French immersion moving from one of the schools to the other, but we thought this will exacerbate the issue, or may exacerbate the issue in those schools, because then we would be moving more kids out, and we'd have to move more in to make the school viable and so on. But it is one of the areas of monitoring that we will continue to look at, and maybe come back to the board with a recommendation at some point to say, this isn't working.
Okay, we have two more follow-ups on this topic. Firstly, from Trustee Oliver, then Trustee Daniele.
Thank you. And this actually builds on Trustee Gray's question and comments and your response, Director Miller. Presently, we have all the Burlington secondary schools, with the exception of one, offering French immersion, Pearson, of course, being extended French. And that, of course, is great from the neighborhood school perspective, but I question about the robustness of the program. I'm wondering what types of courses are offered in those secondary schools, and whether they are taught by topic specialists with FI qualifications. And, where I'm heading with this is that when we're looking at the robustness of a program, what would make French immersion at the secondary level be more of a viable and attractive program and more robust? And that, of course, might then influence enrollment in the different schools and lead to changes in boundaries and the offering of the location. So that is maybe something that we want to explore further. That's kind of peripheral to this, but I just wanted to put it out there.
I will just begin the answer, Trustee Oliver, and then Associate Director Bull will take it from there. And this is partially for the public's, Dallery's information. As this board is well aware, because they approved it last year, a program viability to increase to begin French immersion in grade 2, and French immersion, instead of the 50% model that it currently is in grade 1 through, it will begin at 100% model. That may have an impact going forward on numbers, but it certainly I believe will have an impact on the student's ability to become bilingual or French speaking, be able to speak French. So going forward, some years down the road, this discussion may change, because there may be different kids coming into it. But I'll let Associate Director Bogue talk about the current situation. So,
thanks. Through Madam Chairs to trustees. As I mentioned, for FI in high school, the kids take 10 courses in French. They typically do 4 courses in grade 9, 4 in grade 10, and then 1 in grade 11 and 12. Or sometimes there's a slight variation on those. So each year they do a course in French language, so that's 4 out of their 10 that are done. Typically in grade 9 they'll do geography, often in French. In grade 10 it's often history. And then we look at where the teaching expertise is within the school. So teachers have to have FSL qualifications, but they also need to have some subject qualifications as well. And so if you've got a talented art teacher who has FSL qualification and is fluent in French, you might offer an art course, for example. So there is some flexibility for schools. So again, with more kids and more options, you have more staff, and that provides a little bit more flexibility. I think the second part of your question, Trustee Oliver, was around what would make programs more viable. The numbers certainly are a factor. And it may be something that we want to study a little bit further as the next step from our elementary program viability study, just to talk about French, talk about the number of students that in any particular school, so that we've got viable cohorts and we can provide that choice and opportunity, those kinds of things that you've identified.
I just had a comment. None of our elementary schools at this time do math and French immersion. None of them do mathematique. Beginning in 2018, all our French immersion schools will be doing mathematique. And so because none in our elementary schools are doing it now, none in our secondary schools are doing math in French. The possibility exists going forward that will change based on the fact that they will be getting math in French in elementary school. I'm not saying it will change, but it may change.
Trustee Daniele.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on Trustee Collard's comments. First with a preamble. I had this on my list before you celebrated. Okay, so, and it's not I'm promoting it, but I do feel that it needs to be asked. Earlier, when I asked about the declining numbers at Bateman, the comment was made that the orchard had been moved from Bateman to Hayden, and that immediately made me wonder, did we ever consider sending the orchard kids back to Bateman so that would build the Bateman numbers and bring the Hayden numbers down?
There were options where Robert Bateman stayed open and we did redirect. We looked at several of those. And again, we heard various feedback that similar to the French immersion, they won't go, they'll go to the Catholic school and all of that. But we did run variables that reflected that to provide relief to Hayden and build up Robert Bateman. But again, the problem too in those scenarios is it left MM Robinson unaddressed.
You know about how many students it was in the orchard? Recall, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I would also say the students from the orchard going down to Bateman, Pearson is actually closer to the orchard than Bateman. So we would be moving the kids past another school that has low enrollment. And we wouldn't be addressing the MM Robinson. We would continue to have, so it's.
But we had originally sent them to Bateman, so was that simply to bolster the Bateman numbers when it was built, or instead of sending them to Pearson?
I think it was just a place to put the students because there was no space. You had MMR that was at capacity. I think Pearson was, again, had high enrollments as well. It was just trying to find a space to accommodate those students until a new high school was built in the Halton community.
Thank you. So before we move on, just a skill testing question for everybody. Does anybody remember which trustee started that thread? Absolutely. And that was a long one. But I wanted to thank everybody, firstly, for keeping your questions concise. And I feel like this thread piece is working. Is that right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so Trustee Oliver.
Okay, thank you. Parents and guardians of students in the Community Pathways program have expressed positive comments about the facilities at Bateman. What is unique about these facilities, and what does the proposed move to Nelson and MM Robinson mean in terms of ensuring that similar or improved facilities are provided in those schools? And what are the proposed steps and timelines for Nelson and MMR with respect to the facilities? And what is the proposed transition for these students?
Thank you, Trustee Oliver. I'm going to turn to Superintendent Zonnefeld, and then I may make some comments, and Superintendent Cullen may also be talking about the possible work that would be done on these schools.
Thank you, through the chair to Trustee Oliver. So when you ask what's unique about these facilities, I would say what's unique is really only what's specific to that site at Robert Bateman. That if you visit our other CPP locations across the board, that the elements of those sites that are common across all of those are many in terms of accessibility and teaching spaces and areas for personal care. Those kinds of things have all been tailored to fit those specific sites. So they aren't, so I guess what I'm saying is they aren't unique to Robert Bateman, only in terms of how they fit there. So, because we do have those same elements across the system. The parts of Bateman that maybe are a little more unique in some ways are things like the food school, but even that I hesitate a bit because we do have those in our other, most of our other CPP spaces as well, sites as well. So, and a bit of what we're recommending in this, in this director's recommendations is to ensure that we have those elements in 2 sites in Burlington. So you would see a full, complement of physical aspects of that program in both MMR and at and at Nelson. So I'll say that. And if you look carefully at Robert Bateman, we're able to have the elements that you see there. We're able to accommodate in that space because it was a large open space to start. But the facility itself wasn't purpose-built for that program. If you look carefully, we made that space into what it is by erecting walls and putting up lifts and bringing in change tables and renovating washrooms and those kinds of things. We made it into the space that it is, and it works very well. I will also say that we have done that many times over in other locations and continue to do that. We're doing that basically as we speak. The plans are underway. The permits are in process to expand the program at White Oaks for September. We're expanding that program to accommodate all students that would be in a CPP program for September there. We have great plans there to expand the teaching area around the kitchen facilities and the personal care facilities. And we're going to do a really bang-up job of that renovation and program expansion. So we've done this many times before and continue to do it. So I hope that answers that in terms of the unique nature is really site-specific. We have the ability to bring this on speed very well at Nelson. I'm just looking at your other question. I appreciate you providing it to me in advance. You ask about steps and timelines. So if the director's recommendations are approved by trustees, I'll say that we've taken an initial look at both Nelson and MM in terms of what types of things we would want to change and add there to provide the programming that we're talking about and to really be able to accommodate students well. So that initial look we've done, and you've seen in the report, Superintendent Cullen has outlined what some of those elements would be and some initial look at what those costs might be. We haven't gone further than that because we would really need to know where these recommendations land, the details of that, because that will help us determine the details of the facility work. That will happen. The timeline is that we will get going on that right away if these recommendations are approved. So, without I'd say without delay, maybe the next week we get going because we know that we want to do this well and have the time to do it well. So, and that's part of the reason why the extension of the time from instead of having a September of 18 start, we moved it to 19 so that we are can be assured that all facilities are ready. So we would get going on that right away. And another hope plan really of the September 19 start is to have the renovations completed or near completion in advance of that date. We'd really like to see them done in the spring of 19 so that we can plan for and accommodate the same kinds of transitions that we would do for students who are moving into a new location and we know that our students with special needs need individualized plans for those transitions. Each student is different, and therefore those plans need to be individualized. So often, often in those plans, that includes site visits. So we'd like them to be able to do that and to be able to see those completed facilities in the spring. So we're not shooting for a completion of those renovations in August or in the summer of 19, but more in the springtime, so they can go and visit those facilities and start feeling comfortable in those new locations. Not just the CPP reno, but the rest of the building as well. Become comfortable in those locations so that when they do enter in September, it's a familiar space and a place that they are comfortable in. So that would be part of that planning, both from the facility side and the individual student transition side of things. So that's what we're shooting for with that renovation work. And I'm not, so, I guess I've said some of that about Nelson. I'd echo those same plans for Robinson, because there are some significant changes that facility enhancements we'd be doing there as well. Once again, planning for and shooting for that we can do good transitions and be fully ready. And we don't want anyone concerned that will these enhancements and changes be ready in time. With that September of 19 timeline, we're quite confident that we can be ready.
Thank you. So there's 2 follow-up speakers at this point, Trustee Collard and then Trustee Reynolds.
Specifically regarding the CPP and the renovations to Nelson that would be required in order to move that program, it again begs the question, why rebuild it? We already have it. Not only that, but we have the indoor swimming pool that Robinson also provides, so then the students in the north will have access to the indoor swimming pool that they can access from inside the school without having to go outside at all. And the students in the south will no longer have access to an indoor swimming pool unless they're transported, which I am doubtful that would happen, because we don't do it at the other sites in our board that do not have indoor swimming pools annexed to the schools. So they lose that part of their program entirely. Not only that, Bateman is air conditioned and Nelson is not. When we look at page 25 of the recommendation, we look at the features for the schools. Under the features, Robert Bateman has the longest list: swimming pool, lap pool gallery, special education program expansion, technological education facilities, food hospitality program, which, by the way, is a commercial industrial kitchen that is not present anywhere else in the board, community pathways programs, and childcare. Whereas Nelson lists an auditorium with fixed seat sloped floor, and those seats are as old as the school, so they're 60 years old and they need to be replaced. A weight room, which is a former shop, which wasn't even mentioned on Bateman, and Bateman has a weight room as well, and the stadium with running track and turf field, which is not on our property, that's on the city's property. So I have to ask why we think that we need to rebuild this at Nelson when it already exists and better than what we are going to put at Nelson. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody for your sentiments. I would ask that, who's going to respond to the question?
Point of order, Chair. I just asked the audience that we do need to maintain decorum. I know that this is an emotional topic, but we do have a lot of discussion to go on this evening. That type of applause is something that I ask not to happen throughout the discussion. So I'll ask for your cooperation on that. Thank you.
Okay, so Superintendent Zonabend.
Through the chair to Trustee Collard. Going back to the beginning of your comments about the swimming pool, one of the, that's certainly an element that we've looked at in terms of the possible facility enhancement at Nelson. We've talked to the staff at Bateman and about how much of that pool is used. It's really a very small portion of that. So really you're talking about a therapy pool would be an appropriate enhancement if we did that at Nelson. It's not, like once again, I say it's something that we're considering because we do recognize that as a great option at Bateman. So I believe they're in there about once a week. So we are looking at that, I will say. In terms of your comment around that the other programs don't go out of their buildings to access that, I can speak specifically to Georgetown and the CPP there. They have an indoor pool as part of the school, but they don't actually use it for CPP. The nature of that pool isn't ideal in terms of accessibility and that use by that group of students. So they actually also go to a pool once a week, but they go outside the building. They go down to the Gellert Center in South Georgetown and use that facility because it's better. It's better equipped to support those students. So just point out that is possible and works quite well for those Georgetown students. In terms of the other elements of what you've mentioned and your question as to why we would renovate and possible additions, whatever that might look like at Nelson, it's the recognition that those elements are important, that the physical space is very important in terms of students, that we can provide great instruction, that they are safe and accommodated and can be part of school life. All those things we recognize are very important. So that's why we would ensure that all of those things happen at Nelson. And so we want to make sure that we do that well. So that's why those things would happen there.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move to Trustee Reynolds and Trustee Collard, if it's on this, is it on? Okay, if I could ask you to, because this is a bit of a diversion from Trustee Oliver's original question, just want to recognize that, but please go ahead. And I would ask that the responses also keep us rolling. Thanks.
My question wasn't why we would build it if we're moving the program. Of course we would build it if we're moving the program. My question was, why would we move the program knowing that we have to rebuild it at the cost of $12 million?
And I think that goes back to, sorry, I'll start. I think it goes back to Director Miller's comments around the bigger question of the bigger rationale of moving of the closure of Bateman and the relocation of programs. That's a bigger question about catchment area. The main catchment area and the size of that catchment for Bateman, and from a financial standpoint, it may look like a large amount of money. I think that would be, once again, Director Miller talked about funding from the province as well as from the disposition of lands, and looking at the long term, taking the long view over several years. If we're looking 10, 20 years out, that every year there are significant operating savings as well that support our ability to do all this. So I think in this recommendation, the director is saying that there's the financially, this might look like a lot of money, but those funds can be covered through these other sources, and the long-term financial savings as well. It becomes, I guess, financially not much of an issue.
And I'll just add, if I may, the parameters that triggered this PAR were about student 65% enrollment and potential enhancement of program. It was not about facility conditions. It was not about this. I think we've said all along those are factors, as walkability is a factor and all those other things are a factor. But the primary triggers of this whole PAR were 65% enrollment and enhancement of program. I think if our rationale included that we're changing the rules of what the Board of Trustees approved when I brought the preliminary PAR report. Those parameters and criteria were put out there and that's what triggered the PAR. If I then write the rationale that it should be this school because they have all these facilities, I would say, is that reasonable and fair in the eyes of the community and the eyes of everyone that we've used a different parameter to make a final decision or a final recommendation? And that was a concern for us. You know, things can change. I absolutely get that. But when we wrote this report, we had to be true to the recommendations, to the criteria, which triggered the PAR. And so, hence, there's no question, Trustee Collard is correct. Bateman has a lot of the facilities that are supportive of students. We would argue we can replicate and perhaps, not even perhaps, do purpose-built that are even better than what they currently have. So that's where that argument comes in. So, thanks.
Thank you. Over to Trustee Reynolds.
Thank you. Could you please clarify what is meant by purpose-built versus what it currently exists at Bateman MMR? And I think what parents want to know is that the delivery of special education would be improved for their students. The second comment I would like to just raise is we can't forget about our 283 English students who are at Bateman. And could you please elaborate how the programming for these students would be enhanced?
Sure. I will turn to Superintendent Cullen for the purpose-built part, and then I'll ask Associate Director to answer the other program one.
Thank you. Through the chair to Trustee Reynolds. I think purpose-built in the way that we're using it would delineate between a new build or a newly designed space as opposed to a renovation. Many of the programs that we've put into schools have typically gone into a space because the space was available. The space wasn't selected for that purpose. The space was basically a remnant of some other areas not used by the current school population, and a program has worked its way into that space and been modified. And I would have to say, in conjunction with the comments from Superintendent Zonnefeld, many of the renovations have worked very well. We've done a lot of these. We've learned a lot of things over the course of time, but having the ability to design the space for a purpose as opposed to fit into it makes a significant difference in the ability of the staff and the students to function in those areas. I'll draw your attention to the Bateman area where the program is right now, the CPP. There are about 5 different washroom or change table ortho washrooms, as we refer to them. None of those were there initially. They've all been a modification to an existing space, and there are walls that can't move. There are things that get in the way, so you wind up accommodating and adjusting, but you don't have a blank piece of paper to initially design
it. Just to comment on the English program, I think I heard a figure at Robert Bateman that was just under 300 or just under 400 students are in the English program catchment there. 283? Okay, so it's even just under 300. So think about the number of kids per grade. Even if that was, say, 75 to 80 kids per grade, you've got about 3 different classes of kids, 3 different cohorts of kids that you could schedule into in any given period. So that limits the variety of different options that you take. If you combine those 300 kids with, say, the 800 or 900 kids that are currently at Nelson, you've got a much larger cohort. Divide that by the grades, and you're going to have maybe 300 kids per grade instead of 80 or 90 kids per grade. So, again, if you look at just the sheer numbers, that means more variety. For the English kids at Bateman, they're going to see more variety of courses that typically are offered perhaps at Nelson. And for the Nelson kids, you're also going to see more variety because of the increase in numbers there as well.
And I would add more flexibility in their timetables because there's more sections. As we timetable secondary schools, as Associate Director Bowe mentions, there may be 3 classes of a grade 9 English class in a smaller school. When we combine them, there may now be 10 sections of English class. So students have flexibility that are playing extracurricular or doing extracurricular, co-curricular, or to take different options, but they also have room to move that English into a different slot than what they can in a smaller school. It's kind of fixed. So English is period 1 and period 4 in semester 2 and the lunchtime in semester 1. They've got no choice. But in a larger school, there's 10 possibilities. So it also decreases the number of course conflicts. And I just want to comment on that for a second, because I know in some of the information school improvement, the school information profiles, it's talked about course conflicts, and that some of the smaller schools some of the larger schools had as many course conflicts as smaller schools. But there's a broader, so if we were to look at it in a diagram, the larger schools are offering this many courses. And the smaller schools are offering this many. So those course conflicts are over a smaller number, a smaller breadth of courses. So.
Okay, first time speaker, Trustee L. Harris.
Thank you. And my question actually follows, I think, nicely on this past topic. It's with respect to the enhancement of program trigger for the PAR and student voice, and a reflection that often at the policy level, it's different than what's happening in practicality for the students on the ground. And I would reference what the contents of Appendix 13. And based on those survey responses from across the different schools, so the student survey responses, the vast majority of students at all schools have a similar experience. The vast majority have responded that they've never moved to another school to take a course because it wasn't offered. There are marginal differences, though, I have to say, with respect to, that percentage is lower for the larger schools. However, where there's that marginal difference there, the questions around well-being and the points that, there's an adult that connects with me, that I feel safe in my school, the smaller schools have a marginal advantage in that regard. So my question is, on page 28 of the report, under the bullets related to consolidation funding, there is funding available for right sizing of schools. And I wonder what, if any, opportunities for right sizing were considered under enrolled schools. And again, I recognize that part of your response is likely going to be that this wouldn't positively affect the programming in the schools. However, when I compare and contrast that to the student voice, I'm left perplexed, and I'm again left wondering what consideration to right sizing perhaps as another option has been considered.
I'll address the right sizing first, and then I'll talk about the other part. There was consideration to right sizing schools. There's still a cost to right sizing schools. It's not done at no cost. But again, that's not what triggered this PAR. But you observed right. It doesn't enhance program. It doesn't allow those 200 or 300 students to have any more course offerings or any of those other things. It closes off a building and it makes the school smaller. And I even said that in my initial comments. One of the advantages that students often express with small schools is that there is a more, I hesitate to use the word village because sometimes that has negative connotations. I don't mean it that way. I mean positive connotations. It's got more where kids feel like they belong at times. But that's not true around the entire board. When we look at around the board, we have large schools where kids do feel safe. They do feel belong. In fact, all of our schools, the percentages are fairly high. And some of those schools are 1,400 kids because kids tend to do that in the schools. So it's the small school, that feeling in a small school is not exclusive to a small school. Kids feeling that. Now, with the student voice aspect, yeah, I have no doubt, and I said this at the very beginning in our meetings, our informal meetings that we did at every school. I talked about that no question the kids like their schools. No question they like their teachers. They like their, well, maybe principals, but they like their teachers and they like their schools. There's no question that was, and the results tend to show that that's how kids felt across the board. I met with students. I met with student leaders from each of the schools. Their biggest concern was, not biggest concern, one of the concerns they expressed to us was if schools are closed, is around transitions. Some of those students in the smaller schools expressed the concerns that they weren't getting classes. They weren't able to do these things. And I know the percentages of online courses, as an example, is in here, but in one of our recommended schools, Lester B. Pearson, there's slightly under 400 kids. 227 of them are taking online courses. In Robert Bateman, there's 280 kids. 115 of them are taking online courses. Now, for sure, many are doing that by chance, or by choice, I mean. But lots aren't doing it by choice. They're doing it because they can't get the courses they want. So I guess the question is kind of back to the trustees. There are advantages to small schools. So we've got to weigh up the pluses of that versus the pluses of a larger school in terms of program enhancement and ability to take more programs and be involved in the life of the schools. I had one young person say to me that in one of our schools that, yeah, we do a lot of stuff in our schools. It's all the same people doing it because there's so few of us, like the clubs and all those other things. So, and there would be there's less diversity of thought when it's a smaller place. We know that from our own lived experience, that the smaller it is, yes, there's advantages. One of the disadvantages is the diversity that exists quite often. I'm not saying it's necessarily in this case, but so it's a bit of a difficult question to answer. And I do understand how the students feel, and I expected them to be supportive of their schools. I would not have thought otherwise with that.
Could I just add to that? We did pull our own data beyond the student survey, and Burlington kids, all of Burlington schools, 23% of them have a timetable conflict. You compare that to Oakville, it's 8%. So it is quite a different experience. Milton's 11%. So it does, we can actually capture that, and our e-learning numbers also show that there is a toll in terms of choice to pay with small schools.
And there was a follow-up question from Tracy. Steve.
That's okay. So my follow-up is with respect to e-learning. Can you speak to the trajectory of the Htsb e-learning program? So my understanding is that it's expanding and the demographics that are enrolling in those programs.
Through you, Madam Chair, to trustees and the public. E-learning is expanding in a very big way in our board. I believe that we're leaders in the province in terms of the number of online courses that we offer. Last year, we had over 2,000 kids enrolled in e-learning. The number of classes was up in the 80s. The number of different courses was in the high 40s or 50s. We started e-learning a number of years ago, about 10 years ago, and we started specifically with senior level courses, grade 11 and 12, with the thought that we wanted to get the younger students into our high schools, into their classes, get used to the routines, that sort of thing. So the majority of our courses are at the senior level, and that tends to be where students in schools have some difficulty filling their timetables so that they get the courses that they need for their pathway. So the bulk of the courses are grade 11 and 12. We've also started continuous intake e-learning courses in our board as well, which means kids can start and finish courses at a variety of different times to meet their individual needs. So if a student is stuck and needs to get a course, there's some opportunity there. Typically, the kinds of courses are the core area courses that you might imagine, lots of maths and Englishes, but also social sciences, humanities, sciences as well, those kinds of things. Not a lot, but not a lot in some of the optional areas that you really need to be in a classroom, in a lab or a shop setting, that sort of thing. In terms of where will e-learning go, it will continue to expand, I would expect. When I look at the trajectory, it just has gone up very, very sharply in terms of the number of courses and the buy-in of kids. Is it for every single student? It's not. I mean, we do see some kids that don't take well to e-learning because they like to have that classroom experience. They're very tactile, want to be in a classroom and move around and learn that way. But for many other kids, e-learning is a great option. And it's great that we've got this choice so that kids can augment their timetables with courses that they can't get in their, not necessarily in their home school.
Thank you. Trustee Graves.
Thank you. One of the things that I'm struggling with, and I think what I'm hoping is perhaps you could provide some clarity on what considerations were made in this, and it goes back to something that was alluded to earlier, and it's the over-enrollment in this scenario at Nelson and the under-enrollment still at Central. Particularly because they share a boundary line. And I know that these things don't come in neat little squares. And there's probably some elementary school considerations there in terms of not splitting cohorts. But I am going to struggle a little bit with two schools that are effectively side by side in that they share a boundary with one being, say, at 116% capacity and the other being at 88%. And why would we not put more program or more cohorts into the underrolled one and help ease the pressure at the other?
Were you going to ask?
Well, I was just going to say, what doesn't show up here is we will be adding to Nelson's OTG by the construction piece. It wouldn't be reflected on here. So those percents look higher than they are, just for one piece. It wouldn't totally mitigate it, but it would mitigate a good chunk of it.
If this is approved, we've recommended an addition at Nelson, which of course raises his OTG. We have done a small boundary change in the Nelson Central area, and that's to recognize exactly what you said, to keep a cohort together. Tecumseh Public School currently is split between Burlington Central and Nelson, so we've done a boundary change so that all Tecumseh students would then go to Burlington Central. Is it something that might have to be considered in the future? It's possible, way down the road. Burlington Central is also a school where where fee-paying students attend. And although they don't have a large number, the greatest number of our international fee-paying students are in Oakville. We are in a recruitment process to try to get more, and we're in particular trying to get those students into Burlington. And it's also the ELL Center in Burlington, and there's some intangibles that we haven't based a decision on this at all. But as you know, there are refugees coming into this country, and when they go for their ELL, that's the school they go to. So, in Burlington, we have them in Oakville.
Just to add on to it, one of the points, again, through the community consultation and feedback was the whole downtown redevelopment in Burlington and all the growth that's projected, although we haven't got a final number, that we want to ensure that there will continue to be some built available capacity in the event that we do get more than projected enrollments coming out of the new development in that core area.
Thank you.
Having said that, we do not think that the development that we've heard about will solve the issues. But we need to make sure that we ensure there's some space available for new new developments that are going to occur in downtown Burlington, they certainly will not resolve all the issues, not even close.
Trustee Gerbents.
With regards to that imbalance between Nelson and Central, was there, I know this is, it kind of sits, sits there, we have property, and is there ever, if we close 2 schools, our youngest school in the south, I believe, is 1967, and wouldn't there be a thought, perhaps, of giving the south a new school at the Gary Allen site, and perhaps readjusting the borders at Bateman to have more students, and having, adjusting Central, and having, something nice, something something compliant, AODA compliant, with air conditioning and with amenities, that we can build right.
Through you, chairs, to Trustee Gerbents, I think what you're talking about is a brand-new, shiny rebuild, right? Brand-new big school. Have we thought about that? Yes, we have thought about that. There's a significant issue with that, though. The significant issue is the way boards are funded for schools is we have to go to the province. So it would be, one aspect of it would be, and there's a couple I'll talk about, one aspect of that would be difficult in that we would be making a recommendation that is entirely contingent on the province deciding that they will give us the money to build a new school. They may say no. With the contrast that to the additions we've talked about, we know that we would have the money to do that if the province said no. But the province does support us, the province does provide that, but there's immense pressure on the province of Ontario around budget. And it's tricky. Other boards have attempted to do that, and the answer has not always been positive. The second thing is you would look at, I'm assuming you're talking when you say the Gary Allen site, the old General Brock site as the site of a new school. We've already sold some of that land off. Not much, but we have sold some of that land off. We would then be looking at closing 2 or 3 secondary schools in Burlington in the south. The likely scenario would be Burlington Central, Nelson, and Bateman, if that were the case, or maybe Aldershot, I don't know. But it would, I think, pose great challenges for the communities as well, based on the hope that we might get money to build a new school.
Thank you. Trustee Reynolds and Collard.
Thank you. I'd just like to follow the string regarding the planning comment on the intensification. Can you share with us where you expect in Burlington this increase in population is considered and where it is not?
Well, right now, again, the City of Burlington official plan is just in a draft form. They are focusing on a couple of nodes, one being the core area of Burlington. I believe one near the Appleby Gold Station is another one. I can't remember where the third one is. It might be in Aldershot as well, in Aldershot. So, but again, we have not got confirmation as to, ultimate numbers and more specifically, how many residential units. They've just kind of gave us a very broad brush. So, we haven't included those numbers in whatever has been approved so far, but any additional numbers beyond what's been circulated to us by the city. But we've just got to be cognizant of it. And as Director Miller said, all these higher density type developments are not going to generate sufficient numbers, but we should try to be prudent and maintain some form of capacity in the event that we get more students than projected.
And I would just add to that, the experiences of other boards in high-density areas has not garnered great number of students to their system. I'm not going to mention the boards, but they have got high density in places, and it's not getting a great number of students in there. So this is not contingent on this. We do not expect, even if these development plans come to fruition as they in the City of Burlington's plans, that we would get a great number of students. But we need to keep some spaces. And I want to go back to the Nelson thing for a bit, because we also said one of the things we're going to monitor is the enrollment at Nelson. And if it does become unmanageable, we would bring a recommendation to do a boundary change. So.
It's a direct follow-up? Okay, then Trustee Collard.
I just want to emphasize the consideration that you're talking about is the mobility hubs in Burlington, of which one there is one at Fairview and Brant, also in the catchment of Central. I think those are important observations. I would expect, I know that you're working very hard with Burlington planning and observing the projections, but I think that that's very important that we plan for those potential changes coming down the road.
Thank you, Trustee Collard.
Yes, I was very interested in Trustee Grabenza's thoughts regarding building a new school in the South. The South has 4 high schools, 3 of which are the oldest high schools in Burlington. The youngest high school in Burlington is Robert Bateman. And yet that seems, in South Burlington, yes. And so that seems kind of odd to be closing the youngest of the schools, and it's also the second largest. So when I'm thinking in terms of Trustee Grabenza's suggestion to have a rebuild that is purpose-built and that accommodates a greater number of students, and if we're putting it on the general Brock property that is somewhat in between where Central and Nelson are, it would make sense to at least pursue the thought and find out what the possibilities are. And if that is something that we wish to do as a Board of Trustees, then I would suggest that perhaps we need to be looking at the south part of this recommendation as something that needs to be tabled for now until we've explored some of these more innovative options.
Okay, thank you.
I don't really have a comment to that.
That's good then,
because, you know, we fulfilled our...
Yes, okay, so I just want to remind trustees, we are almost at 8:30, which is almost at 9, and Trustee Harvey Hope is anxiously and patiently waiting to be a first-time speaker.
No, I'm done.
Yeah,
I'm done.
Trustee Oliver has a follow-up on this, and then we're going to move to Trustee Harvey Hope, and then we'll be on to our second-time speakers, and I would just ask that you just be mindful that you're not asking a question that's already been asked as we move forward. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm trying to reform my questions as the discussion happens, so I apologize if it's a bit bumbly, but I guess I'm trying to understand the funding piece for schools and expansions. Concerns have been raised by Burlington residents around the financial implications of closing a school or two and then having to make capital expenditures to make expansions to be able to provide the programs in those newly designated schools. What I'm hearing is that any facilities that, any specialized type of facilities in the schools to be closed can be replicated or expanded in the schools that they will be moving to, and that we have the funds for that, and that's not contingent on any applications to the Ministry of Ed, etc. But I do kind of want to explore the line of thinking of, you know, we would be working with expansions on schools that are 40 plus years old. And does it make sense to do that? Or does it make sense to consolidate and move the consolidated school to a new location and build a new school. And I guess that is really the funding piece that we need to understand to be able to explore.
I'll pass it to Dom in a second, and Controller Sweetman may have some comments. It's hard for us to comment on this because this is a completely new proposal you're suggesting, so.
Through the chair to the chair. The issue of funding for new schools and through consolidations is, there is an opportunity to request funds through capital priorities. And similar, there's another funding mechanism typically that is announced in the fall, in December, similar to that. But you have to remember that there's 72 other school boards in Ontario that are going through the same process and looking at school closures and consolidations. And in some cases, they're not closing 2 schools, they're closing 3, 4 schools. So we have to line ourselves up and present our case. And as Director Miller said, there's no guarantee that we are going to get funding. And our coterminous board has done the same thing. They applied for funding for 2 school closures up in Georgetown, not nothing. And they're keep on going back to the trough. But in my discussions with the ministry, there's only a fixed amount of money available.
And I would just ask, or just add, and Controller Sweetman may jump in as well, but a secondary school is approximately $35 million. It's in around between $30, $35 million. And so the question I would ask about this has been a difficult process for the communities. I know it's been difficult for us, but we're kind of irrelevant in this. It's been difficult for the communities and the students. It would be necessary for us to go through this process again on the hope that we'll get $35 million from the province. We did look at this as a staff. We did not present it to the park because of the very reasons I'm saying now. We have had challenges getting funding for some of the schools we need in growth areas, as some of the trustees around this table know. We have had some real challenges in getting that funding. And that's not a criticism of the province, because the province, as Dom says, has 72 boards, and the challenge in the boards right now, or in the province, is growth is not equal. It's not equitable. Some areas it's growing, some areas it's declining, and so many boards are going through the same process as us. And so the challenge for us is, do we engage in a process again, make a business case for that money? And the answer is no. And if the answer is no, well, what do we say to the communities? Do we do a PAR the following year again to try to consolidate where we are? There's the potential that you're in a perpetual cycle of this. I don't think the communities can take that, and I don't think I personally don't think it's fair to them. I think this has been a divisive process. So, Controller Sweetman, do you want to comment on anything?
I would just add to those comments that I agree with what you're suggesting, that it's very difficult to get those dollars from the province with the 72 other school boards with their own priorities and issues as well. Without that funding, operationally, we would not be able to come up with the funds for a new school at all. There's savings identified within the costings that have been prepared with the recommendation, but there's no way that we would have the amount of savings that would be required to build a new school.
I would just add, it would be difficult for us as a board to try optically, and taxpayers and all that, to start trying to accrue that kind of money and say we're saving for a school, and there's still no guarantee because it's still contingent on approval by the Board of Trustees. So, none of us can predict what that could happen, right? And by the time that happened, there may have been an election, and we've been accruing money to build a new school, and so it becomes a real dilemma that if the province would say, you do this, you got the money, it's easy. But that's not how it works.
Okay, Trustee Reynolds has a follow-up, and I believe Trustee Oliver.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very concerned about the potential of building a mega school, essentially, versus the cost of renovating. We also have to take into account our busing costs, and busing is a huge piece of this conversation, as the consideration goes on infinitesimally. It goes on forever. You're always going to have to bus into that community. And I also am concerned that perhaps you would have to maybe close more schools for that consideration. So I certainly, that would be a big concern for me.
Trustee Oliver?
Okay, thank you. So to follow up on my question around the funds for additions and enhancements to the schools to which students and programs will move, where will that money come from? And will those enhancements and additions be made in a kind of an immediate manner? So ready for when the students are moving in? Or is there some kind of a delayed construction period?
I'm going to look at Superintendent Cullen and Controller Sweetman to answer this. I would just say the intent is it's ready when they move in. But
Again, through the chair, I think Superintendent Zonefeld talked in general about some of the timing, but I'll put some more specifics to it. Part of the reason why the dates have been put in the report the way they are is to allow the time to do the construction. So if you think about a decision that we made this spring, the preliminary planning for addition, renovation, wherever they meet, so confirmation of program location and size, will probably take the course of a couple of months, including the appointment of an architect. A concept will be brought back to the board. There's probably 6 months of detailed technical design work that then occurs before you go out to tender. So our goal would be to have a project of this nature designed and out to the market, for the most part, about this time next year. Being to the early part of the spring is actually the best time to go to the market for those designs, which would then allow contractors to mobilize during the summer months when nobody's there. That way you set up your safety areas, your containment areas, anything that has to be isolated for the construction process, because construction will take place in occupied schools when students are there. So ideally, you use that 2 months to do that setup. So in a very generic time frame, that's what I would see next summer being used for as an optimal mobilization for contractor start time. Construction time, depending on the specific rooms and areas we're talking about, they range, they vary. Some of them are going to be internal, some of them are going to be additions in their entirety. I would give them a range of between 6 to 8 months, depending on exactly, how complicated and how large they are. But we still have to factor in their occupied schools at that time. So progress is slowed down a little to make sure that we're doing them in a safe fashion and those things, which would still have them ready for the dates that we've indicated. But it does mean starting, I think it was indicated earlier, starting the process immediately.
Controller Sweetman will talk about the funds, where the funds would be made available for these additions.
So the way they would be funded is through proceeds of disposition. There would be funds available right now as property is sold. They would add to the proceeds of disposition balance, and these would be used. There's still an approval process to go through to the ministry to agree to the use of the proceeds of disposition, but that would be the first indication of where the dollars would come from.
That is not proceeds of disposition of the potentially closed schools. This is already in existence.
I think that's a great clarification. Thank you. So I'm moving now to Trustee Harvey Hope, first-time speaker.
I have a three-prong, but two of them are information requests. So I will get those out and my actual comment question. One, the secondary gifted numbers. are lumped in some cases, so we don't know what part of the English grouping is in the secondary gifted. And so I know that there has been a request, but I just wanted to make it public that we should know which, in the school that has the secondary gifted placements, we should have that listed as a separate line. Two, on relation to that, how many children are designated gifted as in eligible for the secondary gifted placement, but are not currently in the placement. So that wouldn't be in a chart necessarily, but that would be a number that you would have. Because there are a lot of children that have not gone to Baudouin that would be eligible for secondary gifted once they get to their high school. And so that number would be useful to know. Two, do we have or three, I guess I'm at this point, do we have total projections for the total number of students, period, in Burlington, across all 4 boards, and preferably with a private school type of numbers, like from the city of Burlington, how many students of school age are there in Burlington? Do we have that piece of information? So again, not an answer I'm expecting right now, but that is something that we found when we were in Oakville. We assumed the kids we had were going to be the kids we have. And the population flipped between where they went to school. At any time, the public board is the board everybody ends up in. They can choose to leave and go to one of the other 3 coterminous boards or to the private school system. But bottom line is, if there's a student in Burlington, they could end up at the public system.
Can I comment there?
Sure.
Just, we can say that in our coterminous board, there's around somewhere between 16 and 1,800 students in their schools.
In all, in the 3 Burlington.
Oh, I forgot about Corpus Christi. Sorry. So there's probably there's about 800 or 900 at Assumption, about 800 or 900 at Notre Dame, and Corpus Christi is about 1,100. But it's a good point that you're making, and we'll get that information around.
What I'm suggesting is the same thing we get for the LTAP. I'm sure they have an LTAP, if we could get that piece out of their LTAP to show us. So my question, or my comment, I guess, is we've had a lot of emails about the culture of the schools, how their teachers make them feel safe, that the size of the school makes a difference. And I just wanted to allow some comment, but the staff have a massive impact on the culture of the school. And nowhere in here are we suggesting that any of the staff are displaced. They may be moved from a building with their students. If Bateman closes, they go with their students to Nelson. If one of the other schools closes, there'll be some rearranging, but a lot of it, the same number of students are going to be taught. So wondered how, allowing for a comment on that point, in that the culture of the school isn't just the students in the school or the community that they're in or the geographic location, but it's also the staff, and the staff will help create that or help to move that wherever they end up.
I will start, and then I will turn it over to Executive Officer McFadden. You're exactly right. The culture of the school is very much on the work of the staff in a school, and these schools, Lester B. Pearson and Robert Bateman, have great staffs, and they've helped to perpetuate, they've helped to build a great culture in those schools. But I would argue that we have a great culture in all of those Burlington schools. It's a good culture. The kids feel good, some nuance and some differences and some variability. And the same would be true in Oakville and Milton and Halton Hills. So the staff is significant. In particular, I don't want to point this out, but in particularly the staff of Bateman that works in the CPP and works with the essential level students, they've helped create a culture. So our hope would be, and I'm going to turn it over to Executive Officer McFadden, we can't definitively say any of these things because we're in a staffing process now. We have collective agreements with our federations. Nothing has been approved, so we can't say that if A happens, B will be the result. We can't say that. But I will let Executive Officer McFadden elaborate.
Thank you. Through the chair, you're quite right that our staffing processes are outlined in our collective agreements. And most of those collective agreements have clauses in them that talk about school closures and how staff will migrate to the schools that the students end up being assigned at. Our secondary school teacher collective agreement does not have such a clause. Instead, it indicates that in the event of a school closure, the Human Resources Department staff will meet with the union to work out a process for the migration of the staff to the new sites. We have had preliminary discussions with the union in that regard. However, no decisions will be made between the parties until the board makes their final decision. So to say for certain that the staffs at the schools we are proposing in this recommendation will automatically move to the schools receiving the students has not yet been determined.
2 follow-ups from trustees Collard and Grabentz.
Yes, I actually am sort of going back to the question for information regarding the gifted, and that also leads into a staffing question. Traditionally in Burlington, prior to about 5 or 6 years ago, there were multiple sites for these secondary clustered classes, and 5 or 6 years ago, we as a board determined that those students should be congregated at one site because there were not enough students to even fill one class. And those classes do get, as we say, backfilled by highly able students. And so, given that we usually in any given year do not get a full class of students who have been identified as gifted into a gifted cluster, I have to wonder why we thought it would be a good idea to split the cohort that's been together from grades 1 to 8 when we speak about keeping our cohorts together for all of the other schools, and we have not done that for the gifted cohort, and that is problematic for me. On top of which, we would have to staff that at 2 schools now, and staffing, to find appropriate staffing, it was subject specialization for students with giftedness, is an additional hurdle that would need to be gotten over, and I don't see the logic of moving these students, especially since it was never discussed at any of the park, and we have now been inundated by emails from the community saying, please don't do this to our children.
I will start, and then I'll let Superintendent Sonnefeld talk. You're right. The gifted students are clustered into classes, and then if there's insufficient numbers, they are backfilled with the highly able students, which is what happens in our other sites in the board. Oakville has 3 gifted sites, and there's insufficient numbers to cluster. In all of the schools that there's the gifted sites, there's insufficient numbers to have a complete class, so they're backfilled with highly able. So it will be consistent with the rest of the board. However, I understand what you're saying, and it would be I would anticipate that students that are identified gifted, we would start the class in the north and one in the south, but kids would have the option of going. The ones in the south would have to go to the south, and the ones in the north, sorry, they don't have to go to the south, but kids would have the option, because that's typically what we do in the other areas where there's gifted classes. So those cohorts that stay together, because some students may say, you know what, I live close to M.M. Robinson and I'm identified gifted, I'm going to go there. I'm not going to go on the bus and go down south, and vice versa. So, yeah, so there would be that intention. I'll let Mark, Superintendent Sonnefeld, weigh in. And you're right about the staffing, but he'll weigh in about that.
Just follow up, would you be providing transportation regardless of which site a student chose?
We'd have to talk about that aspect of it, but I wouldn't say it's got to be a consideration. So, but I'm not going to make any commitments to anything at this point.
Okay, Superintendent Sonnefeld, do you have a contribution?
Sure. Through the chair, just being mindful of the intent of creating 2 fully composite sites, north and south, is to make the all programs more accessible to students. So we have, students that all need to right now all go south for access. So that's one of the intents. And when you talk about the size of those cohorts, it plays out across every one of our programs when we look at our data, that the closer that program is to a body of students, the more likely they are to choose it because of proximity, transportation times, et cetera. So we anticipate that by offering 2 sites, you would actually see more students who are in elementary gifted choose secondary because those programs are closer to them.
I'm assuming it's directly related, and then we're going to move on to the next follow-up questions.
Except that these students have been together from grades 1 to 8 as a cohort, and we are not splitting any other cohorts, and I'm not expecting a response. I just wanted to make that comment.
Okay, that point's been made. Thank you. Trustee Gerbentz and then Trustee Reynolds.
Thank you. So as the trustee for Charles R. Baudouin, I have been definitely contacted by a lot of that community, very upset about the split in the cohort because, as Trustee Collard said, a lot of these students have been together since grade 1, and you don't pick your friends in your classroom based on where they are in regards to the QEW. So a lot of parents, that school is figures in kind of in a funny way in this recommendation because the English students will now go to Hayden, the French immersion students will go to Robinson, and the gifted students will be split between Nelson and Robinson. So there is a lot of splitting of cohorts at that particular school, and people are not happy.
Okay, thank you. I think that point has been heard. Thank you. Trustee Reynolds.
Yeah, I was going to just inquire as to whether the investigation as to sending all the gifted students to perhaps or Central to bump up their numbers, whether that was a consideration.
We did look at sending them all to Burlington Central. We did not look at sending them all to Robinson, but we determined that Nelson is a good site for those kids. It has been. So.
One more question: are we considering grandfathering for these students who are currently in this program?
Yeah, absolutely. It's in the recommendation. It's not in the recommendation. It's in the implications of the recommendation.
Okay. And that is on the video and voice recording, so that's a great clarification. So I'm just looking at the time and our list of speakers. Pardon? Sorry, Trustee? Oh, okay. We're working the technology up here. So I'm just going to say there's 4 or 5 more people on the speakers list, and we are approaching 9 o'clock. So I would encourage you to, keep it short, but let's work through and see where we go. Okay, so it looks like Trustee Collard, Pappen, Daniele, then Gray.
It's unfortunate this is only a 3-hour meeting because I think I could have monopolized the entire 3 hours. My question is regarding optional attendance. It's a 2-pronged question. I've been hearing from members of the community that when they are applying for optional attendance for the next school year, they're being declined, specifically because they're being asked to wait for the end of the PAR to determine whether or not they actually do want optional attendance at another school. And this has been problematic, and I wanted to have some comment from the director on this because it has been upsetting to a number of parents who have requested optional attendance and been turned away. But my second question regarding optional attendance is a clarification around what we can do as a board to ensure that people are not claiming to live at one address while they don't, in order to get attendance at a school when they actually don't live in the catchment? And that is a question that came up at a meeting I was at about a month ago.
I'll start with the first answer, and I'll ask Superintendent Blackwell to also weigh in, and maybe Superintendent Truffin. The first question, we have been declining optional attendance in Burlington high schools for some time. The criteria we use around most optional attendance, there are always exceptional or extenuating circumstances depending on an individual student's circumstance. It could be mental health or it could be something else. But the criteria we generally use is there space in the school they're asking for? And if there is, we may say yes. But if it's going to have a detrimental effect on the school they're leaving, then we'll say no. And that's been the case for some time. For this year I know Superintendent Blackwell's been dealing with a number of them, as has Superintendent Etoff. And then I'll ask Superintendent Truffin to talk about the second part.
Thank you. Through the chairs, to Trustee Collard. The comments that you've heard around the denial of optional attendance until the decision around the PAR, my colleagues and myself have not used that as a rationale. We have a process, and our process and our belief is that we are making the decisions based on the current state of schools at this time. I have not, and I know my colleagues have not, said we're waiting until a decision. We've made a decision based on what we know about our schools now and for the schools for next year.
That would include IB, because we've heard from IB, but we would have denied it last year. So we're denying it this year. And it's not contingent on the PAR. Some people are suggesting that's the case, but it's not.
Just to answer your second question, Trustee Collard, in terms of optional attendance and addresses, our student information system can be run by our school offices and our system analyst, and it looks for addresses that are out of catchment, and it also looks for addresses that are duplicate. So our administrators do run that information every year, and we do follow up with families that have addresses that are out of catchment and or duplicate.
Thank you very much. Trustee Pappen.
Thank you. Through the chairs to Director Miller. My question has to do with Aldershot. And I noticed from the 6 recommendations that Aldershot is only in one. It's number 6, and it is to explore the site for a magnet program or themed school. And other than that, nothing really has changed at Aldershot. And they're still struggling with low enrollment. So I'm wondering how that fits into your 2 recommendations as far as equity of programming and under 65% utilization.
Through you to Trustee Pappen, you're absolutely correct. Aldershot does not change at this point. It may change in the future depending on what this report comes back to say to create a magnet school. And it could change by 2018. But as I said at the very top, are we prepared, are the Board of Trustees prepared to accept 1, maybe 2 small schools? At the moment, we have 5 small secondary schools in Burlington. Given Aldershot's geographic location, we determined that that's something we'll put to the trustees for their deliberation. And so basically that's what it comes down to. We as staff have said, yeah, we're trying to rectify this, equity of opportunity, and we're prepared to accept, as we do in Halton Hills, a small secondary school or a low enrollment, not small, low enrollment secondary school, and for the trustees' consideration. The magnet theme school is a big unknown. Some boards have been successful, some haven't. Some have attracted students from around their board, some haven't.
Thank you. Trustee Daniele.
Thank you. I have two questions, but they're really small because I recognize the time. Appendix 14, the staff survey. You've given us the question, but we have not been given any results of the staff survey, and I wondered if we would be receiving that. And my second question, forgive me if it's somewhere in this mound of paper has been spoken to, but the student who starts grade 7 extended French at Sir Ernest Macmillan next year, where does he go? When Pearson closes, where does that student go?
MM.
Thank you. I
And then
figured it
Todd
was
will answer
somewhere
the
in
other
there, but I just couldn't seem to find it.
And the first question was with respect to the provision of the data.
Yes, appendix number 14. I have the
Yeah.
question that was sent.
We
to
did the staff survey. At the time we did the staff survey, it was to give them voice. We reviewed it. We didn't at the time tell them we would be sharing out publicly the results. So we redacted them. Some of them were, you didn't want to have somebody identifying himself. And at the point, in terms of, full disclosure, at the time we did the survey, we didn't note that it would be part of the report or included in the public document. We are looking at other ways to continually engage with the staff now and have that presented to you in recognition of that.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Superintendent Etoff and myself met with the Bateman staff and the Pearson staff on Monday morning, and we talked to them about how we can do that process for their input to be provided to the Board of Trustees.
As a follow-up, please understand that for those of us as the decision makers do not have that data. I understand maybe not making it public, but I think for us it would be an important piece of the puzzle. And for me, there's a personal frustration that you would think to include it as appendice, but not actually include any data that could be used. So I understand it not being public, but I would like to see something come to trustees if we're going to make a decision.
Then we
on
will
this, please.
provide it.
Thank you.
It would be, some of it would be redacted, of course. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Onward to Trustee Gray.
Thank you very much. I'll be really quick. Two quick questions. The PAR process. I have followed the Appendice 3, looking at the entire PAR process, top to bottom, and in consultation with my, in discussion with my coterminous board trustee up in Halton Hills, I was led to understand that they too have undergone a different PAR process, the smaller one, but that ultimately, at the end of their PAR process, their recommendations were turned back from the ministry. So my question is, what does the Ministry of Education play in our final deliberations? And could our final deliberations be turned back? That's the first question. The second question, really quickly, is you've got 6 recommendations in your report. Will those recommendations be split out? In other words, is it possible that the Board of Trustees here may support some of those recommendations, but not all of them?
I'll answer the second part.
In terms of the first part, I think the reference from the coterminous board was that they had applied for funding. They went through a process of looking at school closures, and they applied for funding for the reconstruction of a new school, as pending the as a result of the school closure process, and they were denied. And in some cases, the trustees did not approve like the Southeast Burlington Elementary PAR that they undertook. There were recommendations by staff, by the director to the board, and the board basically did not approve any of them. They just kind of deferred the decision or didn't approve the decision. But that was the only thing about the ministry's approval was funding, capital funding.
And and this is also for the public, we are a public institution, and people, as is the Board of Trustees, as elected officials, people can challenge the decision by the Board of Trustees. They can challenge the recommendation, but ultimately what's the significant part is challenging the decision. And there are things open to them, like a ministerial review or a judicial review. What they typically look at is, did we follow process? They generally do not look at the outcome. They look at process. And if we have followed the process as per our policy, I couldn't speak as to how that would, if someone challenged us around that, how that would be, but that's a possibility for a community, people in the community. And to your last question around can trustees accept parts of it, or the answer to that is absolutely. Yeah, the Board of Trustees has a range of options here that they can do. They can say, we'll support recommendation 1, recommendation 2, whatever. And I'm just saying that. I'm not using recommendation 5, recommendation 6. There will be a challenge if one recommendation is approved, but it's tied to something else, that we'll have to kind of figure out how to do that. But absolutely, trustees, this is never an all or nothing package. It's within the purview of trustees to support what they believe is the right decision. Right.
Okay, a question from Trustee L. Harrison.
Thank you. My question is with respect to the community partnerships, and I wonder what efforts have taken place since our official meeting last year to explore partnerships. The report notes that there's ongoing discussions with the City of Burlington, but that nothing has been concluded to this date, and I just wonder whether what that looks like and if there's any possibilities of community partners coming forward in the short term.
We have not done anything else since last year's CPP meeting. We've had some discussions with the City of Burlington, and more or less their question was, what is the status of the schools moving forward? What is going to happen with the PAR process? You know, I think any community partner is not going to engage in a process or looking at renting of space or whatnot if that school could potentially be closed. So things may change moving forward depending on what the outcome of this PAR process is going to be. We will likely engage another CPP process public meeting in June once the board makes a decision, just again, to engage the community. And again, there is no time limit. You know, if there are opportunities out there and people are interested, we're willing to listen and to discuss with them. But we are going through our CPP process, and we'll again do so this year.
And I would just add, I have attended meetings where people have talked about it. I've talked to organizations, and I've suggested how they could pursue the partnership with us, or we would contact them. And I have given those names to Dom, and none of them have even come close to fruition. They didn't even get to a preliminary conversation. The partners were... One of the great challenges with the partnership program, the CPP, we need to, I think it's fantastic. I think everybody would, to utilize our schools. But there's a notion, at least initially, I don't know if that's still a notion, that it's free. They come into our schools and they have the space free. Well, there's a cost, obviously, because we have caretaking costs and all those other things. So, and our experience in this board is not dissimilar to boards around the province, that there's not a whole ton of partnerships popping up that we can get into the buildings. It's just not happening.
Thank you. We have 2 speakers left on this agenda item, and then, oh, that was sneaky. Looks like 3. And then we will turn the meeting back over to Vice Chair Graves. Trustee Reynolds.
My question's regarding accessibility amendments that need to be still considered for all our schools. I'd like to draw our attention to page 8 in the report. There's a comment that throughout the process, criteria 4, the current physical condition of the schools that negatively impacts the optimum operation of a building and program delivery was not considered, was discussed repeatedly at the park, but was not utilized as one of the criteria for initiating the PAR. My question would be, how much weight should trustees give this consideration to the remaining schools? Knowing that AODA is an absolute modification, notwithstanding that we must complete.
I would, essentially you're asking for my advice on how trustees should weigh these different criteria, I think. I will go back to the parameters that triggered the PAR. Facilities, AODA, additions to buildings, geography, whether kids walk to school, availability of programs are all factors that will be factored in. And I can't suggest to trustees how much each of those will weigh into your thinking. I know our recommendation was based on those two criteria. And there are, no question, facility differences. There's no question there are differences in getting one school up to AODA standards versus another in terms of costs. But we did not make that the criteria because those costs can be absorbed, for one reason, because we will have money from operational costs savings, and ultimately we will have money from proceeds of disposition. But the AODA, at this moment, we have to be compliant. So that's not just Burlington, that's our entire board. And we will have to figure out that, regardless of this decision that the board makes. So if the board chooses to say we're not going to close any schools, we'll have to figure out how to do that and figure out how to pay for it.
That was my next question. Is there any funding opportunities to assist the board? Because all boards will have to make sure that all schools are AODA compliant by 2025, notwithstanding.
We haven't heard anything, but I'm going to let Superintendent Cullen elaborate.
Through the chair to Trustee Reynolds, at this point, there's no specific fund for that. Yes, the province is very aware, and provincially, the issue's been raised many, many times. There are a couple of programs that have included an accessibility component, but the programs have had a much bigger target audience than just the ODA compliance. They're kind of tagged along with it if you're doing a renovation, and it gets included in that. But to actually address the known needs across the province in the education facilities, there is no specific funding source. The Premier, in late December, I believe it was, announced there was also going to be a new set of standards and criteria developed for accessibility in the education sector. And we're, again, anxious to see what those are, hoping that when they get announced specific to education, there may also be a funding commitment attached to that, but that's optimistic on our part at this point in time.
So the projections could actually change.
Yes.
Thank you. Trustee Gerbentz has a follow-up.
So moving the IB program from Bateman to Central, which is not AODA compliant, what happens, and I'm sure this probably be a quick answer, what happens if we have students that have physical disabilities that want to attend the IB program, considering it'll be the only one in the city?
I'm sorry, the question is, what would we do if there are students with physical disabilities that would need to attend Burlington Central High School? IB students. We would do what we would do with any situation where we've got students that have required courses. Then we'd have to look at things like first floor classes for those kids. We can reorganize classes within the building. We wouldn't have classes upstairs, for example, if there was no way for them to get up there. It would depend on what those accessibility needs are, and we do modifications to buildings as needed for kids when we can plan for their entry, and so those would be conversations as well. It might mean moving some things, some of our AODA compliance pieces forward, perhaps, if there was a student that needed access to that program.
And I would add, in our IB program in Oakville, we did face that challenge, and we had to address it. We had a couple of students that had needs, and we met their needs so they could attend the program.
Thank you. So Trustee Collard is the third time speaker, as is Trustee Gerbentz, and then we will wrap this agenda item. Thanks.
I have so many more questions. And now I have to pick. Okay, I'm going to move to the IB question. Moving IB isn't a decision that the board gets to make. That's made by the International Baccalaureate Organization, and they determine whether or not we are allowed to move the IB program. If they determine that they will not allow the IB program to be placed at Central, what will happen to the IB program in Burlington?
I will start, and Associate Director Bogue will do. They don't actually determine. They don't determine where we put IB. They determine whether we've complied with the standards that they set, and there are conditions that we would have to meet. And we have had conversations, and I'll let Associate Director Bogue talk about that. We have had conversations with them around those conditions.
Yes. Yes, in addition, through you, Madam Chair, to Trustee Collard, I've had several conversations with the IB organization. And in fact, I was involved when we first brought IB to Robert Bateman, and it was quite an extensive process. And they would come out and look at all kinds of things, including the amount of technology in your building and the standards. Our board is so far ahead of many of the other boards across the continent that I don't perceive that to be a challenge. And in fact, to move a program is much easier than to start a brand new program from scratch. We're in very good standing with the IB organization. They have some criteria on the number of staff that would move or that we would have to have trained, number of training for administrators, those kinds of things, that we've got a lot of capacity within the board, both at Robert Bateman and within other schools as well within Burlington. We've got IB trained teachers and those kinds of things. The nice thing with this particular recommendation is that we've got a little bit more time as well to plan and prepare for that. So we would follow the process that they've got, that they put in place for consolidating or moving a program. And in my conversations with them, it didn't sound like it was in any way similar to the initial application that we went through several years ago.
And there are examples in Ontario where IB programs have been moved.
So then you are satisfied that there would be no issue with moving the program? And if there was an issue to moving the program, what would happen?
We're not concerned that we won't be able to move it.
Thank you. Trustee Gerbens.
This is actually a comment. I just want to thank the staff for working very hard on this report, and the PAR committee for working very hard. I mean, it's been a lot of months, and I'm sure hours and hours and hours of work. And we all know that there's been a lot of lobbying. It's been hard on the community. And I just want to say I really appreciate the work that you've done.
Okay, so that wraps up our speakers list. Trustees, I anticipate that the mechanism to request additional information is as we have been doing, and that the next opportunity to ask questions in public session, which is critical, as well, is Wednesday, May the 17th, when this item comes before the board as an information item. For members of the public, just a reminder with respect to the delegations, 2 special delegation nights for this topic have been set aside, Monday, May 8th and Thursday, May 11th. Up to 25 delegations can be heard on each of those nights. And I would again direct you to hdsb.ca. It's right on the banner there, where you can get the delegation information as well as the specific form to fill out. So I would encourage you to do that as soon as possible with as much detail as possible. And I think we all really look forward to hearing from you. And I want to thank you all for your patience on this particular item. So I see your hand up. May I ask a question from the floor? So thank you. I didn't actually say yes, sir.
No, thank you. Excuse me, sir. I'm sorry. Excuse me, sir. You're going to have to sit down, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Sir? Trustees, at this point in time, since the gallery is not adhering to our rules, I'll ask you to rise, and we will reconvene when the gallery is able to comply with our expectations for a public meeting. Thank you very much.